Good evening. I'd like to call our regular council meeting on Monday, May 27th to order at 6 p.m. Good evening and welcome to members of the public, both here in the council chamber and those who may be watching the live web stream. Good evening to colleagues on council. I am Mayor McNeil-Smith. To my far left is Councillor Novick, Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Garnett, Councillor Duncan, and Councillor Duck. Councillor Renewal is joining us this evening online. Good evening, Councillor Renewal. And good evening to staff who are in attendance for the meeting this evening. I'd like to acknowledge respectfully that we're holding our meeting this evening in the territory of the Saanich Nations, the Sayote Nation, the Sartlip Nation, the Pakwachin Nation, the Sycam Nation, and the Malahat Nation. We're grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waters for millennia, and grateful to be living on these lands and sharing these lands. In turning to approval of the agenda, since the agenda was published last Thursday, we've received 3 additional pieces of correspondence, and I'll just note that they are from Jennifer London, from Corrine Siddle, and from Jordan Milne. So they will be amended to be included in tonight's agenda. And we've also have several pieces of correspondence from Peter Wainwright that was received between April 15th and April 30th. 3 pieces of Peter Wainwright's correspondence is included in the agenda package under the public engagement, and these items are being included at this time. Additionally, we have a request from Councillor O'Keefe to provide a councillor update on Accessibility Week, and a request from Councillor Duck to raise item 15.6, which is under our correspondence for information, and raise that to correspondence. We do have one item under correspondence, and so that will become item 14B, and that is the letter from Artsy regarding the town's funding. So with those changes and additions, I would look for a mover and second that our agenda be approved as amended. Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novick. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? None are opposed. The motion carries. Thank you. We're next turning to our regular public participation period, where we provide the opportunity for members of the public to address council. We ask that you keep your comments to 4 minutes, provide your name and community that you reside in, or the organization that you represent. And I am first going to turn to a participant online tonight and welcome Mariah O'Brien to public participation. And if you can hear us, Ms. O'Brien, the floor is yours for the next 4 minutes.
Okay, I think, can you hear me now?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. Good evening, Mayor and Council. My goal tonight is to emphasize the value that the town has received from the very limited amount of public participation which you have allowed on your merged OCP suggested zoning changes and EB mandated zoning changes, which you have chosen to implement together as Bylaw 2275. My analysis is based on Corey Newcomb's excellent report of the engagement process thus far, which is in tonight's agenda package. It describes, or it includes, 11 topics where staff chose to make changes based on what citizens have contributed in 48 letters. I am reciting the list to emphasize their scope. I am not a planner and could not explain the meaning of most of these changes. The significance to my argument is the fact that there are 11 areas in which staff recognized the benefit of the community feedback thus far. The areas are an improved focus in the marine industrial area, a few definitions clarified for the entire report, improved emphasis on green space in some instances, a reduction in the permitted uses in the MT2 zone, which was in keeping with the requests of writers from that district. A staff-initiated legal review, which was requested by participants. Improved use of color shading to differentiate zones on the maps. Some regulations with regard to trees were improved. One area was changed that was to be designated as R7, and it's now to be RM6. Allowed secondary suites in all RM zones and M2 zones. They removed the requirement that all parking be underground in the C1 zone, and that In 3-bedroom residences, the staff have removed the requirement that all 3 bedrooms be on the first or second floor. These are all changes that were suggested by public participation. These are a significant number of changes, some of them minor, some more significant, particularly to the people whose properties are being affected. All this was accomplished when public participation was limited to a very short period. However, this draft zoning document also acknowledges topics of concern shared by staff and citizen that are not yet well resolved. They include parking requirements, use of permeable space surfaces, infrastructure beyond water and sewage, the space and need for modes of transportation to service the increased density of Sydney. In conclusion, it is important to stress Sydney's current relative density per square kilometer, current to other Saanich Peninsula residences per square kilometer. Sydney has 1,400, and these are approximate numbers gained from ChatGPT. Sydney has 1,400 residents per square kilometer. Central Saanich has 405, and North Saanich has only 3. The changes in density being required by the EB law are going to affect Sydney very differently from the other municipalities. It makes Sydney, if the changes double the residential density as they would like them to do, Sydney's residential density per square kilometer will be closer to the current residential density of downtown Toronto than it is to anything else on this peninsula. Downtown Toronto is currently 3,240, and we would be 2,800. So if the EB government's desired doubling of residential densities actually results from their mandated zoning changes, Sydney will have a residential density per kilometer more comparable to the major cities of North America than to any other nearby municipality. Sorry, I repeated that. My hope going forward is that town staff, town governments, town residents, and town community associations, such as the Roberts Bay Association and the Sydney Community Association, will see each other as allies in solving Sydney's challenge of rapidly increasing its population density on a very limited amount of land squeezed between an airport and an ocean. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mariah Bryan, for coming forward this evening. We appreciate your input and your remarks. Okay. If you would be comfortable signing off now and perhaps rejoining the live webcast.
Yes.
Thank you. Point of order.
Or clarification.
Go ahead.
Going back to the agenda, I think I heard an item related to ARTC.
Item 15.6.
And so I just wanted to, being the ARTC, I wasn't sure if that was related to ARTC or something.
Your microphone. Point of information, it's relating to 15.6, which is the noise attenuation letter, not 15.5. But I think that was understood. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm looking at the agenda as published, and which item were you intending to raise, Councillor Duck?
15.6, email from D. Carlsen regarding noise attenuation for 2180 Beacon Avenue West, dated May 16th, 2024.
So I stand corrected, and that is the letter that's being raised. Thank you, Councillor Keefe and Councillor Duck, for raising and clarifying that. We'll now continue with public participation, and I'll call for a second time for any speakers who wish to come forward. Good evening. We just have a little button at the bottom of the microphone there.
Good. Yep, there we go. Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. My name is Richard Holmes. I live at 10690 Blue Heron Road, which is in North Saanich. However, I also have a house on Resthaven where my daughter lives, and I pay the taxes, so I think I have a right to to say nothing of the commercial properties that we own on the northwest and southwest corner of Beacon and 5th, which is the main purpose of my question here. I have attended the very well organized public access to the zoning reports, etc. And I have asked a couple of questions and I haven't got answers that make sense to me. They focus on two points. The first point is that the government, the senior government, is going to be establishing housing start supply targets. It has for all the municipalities that have been brought in under Bill 44 and Bill 47, and Town of Sydney has just recently been identified as being under Bill 44 and 47. So my question is specifically, what is Planning Department doing about addressing that very likely case that the province will be bringing its heavy hand to bear on this matter? The other question, which is more specific, that's a general question. The more specific question relates to Beacon North and Beacon South, either further to the northwest corner and southwest corner of Beacon South, Beacon and Fifth Avenue. They are, in my view, under what is called the transit-oriented area. I asked, which is defined under Bill 47 as an area within a prescribed distance from a transit station, and a transit station means a prescribed bus stop, bus exchange, passenger rail station, or other transit facility. So our corners, for example, happen to have 9 bus stops right on the edge of the property, including Transit 81, 82, 83, 88, 87, 60, and my eyes are going. There's 9 of them. The point being that it is clearly a transit-oriented area, as defined under Bill 47. And if indeed it is a transit area, oriented area, what is this zoning bylaw doing with regard to that? Because presumably the method of would be used by the government would be to take a pair of dividers and draw a concentric circle of 200 meters, 400 meters, all of those properties would be right under that transit-oriented area. The significance of a transit-oriented area should not be lost in the time spent thinking about it. There's over 3,000 people employed on West Sydney, most of whom have better than average incomes, well-skilled people with good incomes. More than 70% of them have nowhere to live in Sydney. And so they drive their F-115s off to Langford every night, spend 30, 60 kilometers a day leaving our community. That seems to me be ironic when we have a Green MP and a Green MLA. We should make an effort to attend to the needs of those people on the other side, and they are not being met. You cannot afford to buy or find a place in Sydney for most of them, even though these are people with incomes in excess of 100 grand. I'll leave it at that. I should have put it in a letter form. Might have been easier for you all to review it afterwards. And I'll certainly will do that if you like, and I can formulate it slightly more favorably. But specifically, transit-oriented areas should be identified in the zoning.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I've certainly noted the points. I'm sure others have as well. And when we get to item 13A, we would be pleased to answer both those questions at that time.
Great, thanks.
Thank you for coming forward. Please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. My name is Bill Collins. I live at 2028 Westbrook Drive, and I'm also founder and director of Cascadia Seaweed at C9774 3rd Street. I'm here today to talk about zoning bylaw 2275 with respect to water lots in front and along the coast of Sydney. And very specifically, I'm here to suggest that those water lots should be amenable and zoned to support seaweed cultivation or seaweed restoration. Mr. Mayor and Council, the world is wising up now to a very dire problem we have along coastal communities globally, and that is the loss of seaweed. Seaweed being a net primary producer. Some say in some studies it's more important for the earth than tropical rainforests as a net primary producer. So we have to protect our coastal zone in every move that we make. And I'm suggesting here that by allowing zoning for uses of that area, that water lot, of seaweed cultivation, that is artificial growing of seaweed on ropes and or other infrastructure, or seaweed restoration, which falls under the role of replanting seaweed, again using artificial means, but monitoring the improvement of the biodiversity from that natural cultivation. If we have that, we will be part of the world's trying to address the problem of loss of coastal biodiversity. And as we've just heard, the town expects to have a higher population density. We will put more pressure on those coastal oceans that we so dearly treasure as an asset. So I suggest to you that if these water lots could carry zoning such that seaweed cultivation or seaweed restoration was a permitted use, notwithstanding the other provincial and federal permits required. But from Sydney's perspective, I think we would lead the charge in coastal British Columbia and perhaps even around the world in protecting this valuable natural resource.
Thank you for bringing the idea forward this evening. We will discuss it under we will now discuss it under item 13A this evening. Thank you. I'll call for a second time for those wishing to come forward. Good evening.
Good evening. David Calverley. I am still a resident of Sydney. A comment about, yes, item 13A, Draft Zoning Bylaw 2275, and acknowledging the compressed schedule that other people have talked about. That we've gone through. I actually would like to thank staff for the commitment to communication during the public engagement process. The continuous updates on the town website, the detailed FAQs and the posts on social media were excellent. I can make a lot of similar comments about the updates that have been given to the draft bylaw. Obviously a lot of thought and consideration has been given in response to that public input. Could input have been better? Could we have done better if we'd had more time? We're fortunate that we have a good supply of communication and planning experts living in Sydney, not employed by the town, and sometimes I mistakenly pretend to be one of those, so I don't know. But I do know that, unfortunately, to quote the Rolling Stones, you don't always get what you want. I would, however, like to comment on the marine industrial zoning 4.6.6 in the staff report. I welcome the changes that have been made, absolutely, particularly the reduction of dwelling units in W1U. I would like to see the staff recommendation to reduce the number to one dwelling unit per lot adopted when you consider later. I would have obviously preferred that it was 0 on both sides, because when there's conflict between residents and industrial uses, it seems that the residents always win. And this area is too precious to encourage further conflicts, so if we could eliminate further dwellings to start with, that would be a step in the right direction. I'd also suggest eliminating brew pubs and personal services from permitted uses. Neither in my simple mind fits with marine industrial. A brew pub could be part of a restaurant, and restaurant is in there, maybe part of a marina. I understand that, but personal services is surely a retail category. Do we want to see such services on the west side industrial area, for example? Not really. Finally, I want to recognise the difficulty of balancing the interface between residential and industrial areas, which was mentioned in the staff report. It is different, and it is very difficult to get that balance. The Gallaran neighbourhood zoning shows how rough that can be, and the comments that have come back about that, where we have housing abutting what was at one point zoned industrial. Maybe there's a lesson to be learned there, and just as a suggestion, perhaps council could consider in future a Harbour Road local area plan. That would set out a clear vision for this zone that generates a portion of Sydney's economy that is disproportionately high for the land used. And I think there we might get some guidance in the future. That's down the road, but it's just a suggestion. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for coming forward this evening. I'll turn to our next speaker. Good evening.
Good evening.
Just a button there for the red mic.
Yep. Awesome. Good evening, Mayor and members of council. My name is Jordan Milne. I am one of the owners of 9522 Lochside Drive. I sent you correspondence that was noted, and so I'll try to be brief with my comments. As many of you know, a number of years ago, we proposed an initial concept for community feedback on the Cedarwood site that involved 3-story townhouses. And those 3-story townhouses would have allowed suitable spaces on the main floor, enabling a greater diversity of housing that we could accommodate, meeting Sydney's housing needs by creating more economical rental accommodations for its workforce. As a result of the OCP, a 2.5-story height determination was made for the townhouse residential designations, which we've respected, and we are extremely grateful for the approval and consideration that this council provided to us earlier this year by approving the site-specific zone for the townhouse component of that site at CD 45. As a result of the provincial changes, what happened in the OCP, which is having townhouse residential designations that are a transition to the traditional residential R1 and R2 zones, is no more. Because now the R1 and R2 zones could be between a 1.2 and 1.35 FSR, if you do the calculation based on site coverage and height, and they're allowed to be 12 stories in height. The 2.5-story height limitation is a significant limitation, especially when you consider floodplain construction level. We ourselves are facing a significant challenge now in trying to figure out how we economically deliver that project given the rising construction costs. A 3-story height form is a more economical one to build. It also creates a more diverse housing typology of what can be created. It would make sense to treat RM5, and in our case, CD45 zones, the townhouse residential, with the same height as what is now going to be adjacent to them in R1 and R2 at 12 meters in height. I understand there's an issue possibly with respect to the OCP dealing with 2.5 stories. As I've mentioned in the past, many municipalities do not define a half story by forcing it to go in ground. An example is the City of Victoria. And so one thing that this council could choose to do in not reopening the OCP is section 5.1.7 of Draft Zoning Bylaw 2275 details what the determining of a story. And it details the determining of a story can't be more than 1.2 meters, I believe it is, outside of the ground. Under the R1 and R2, staff have identified that a 3rd story of a building can't be more than 70% of the floor below it. That is another way of defining a half story. Without changing your OCP, you could amend the definition in section 5.1.7 of the determining a story in this zoning bylaw to allow for a half story to be considered a maximum of 70% of the floor below it. By doing that, and by allowing 12 meters in our CD45 and in the RM5 zones, you would enable effectively the same outcome that could be achieved on a neighboring R1 and R2 zone, with one exception. On an R1 zone, you could actually still build a denser building. This is important for Sydney. If Sydney does not want to see the focus of change becoming the R1 and R2 zones and really wants to focus that change as the OCP identified in the traditional residential, this would make it more logical to pursue RM5. Right now, the way that this is drafted, a developer would be incentivized to pursue R1 and R2. There is no bonus density, and you get more height right out the gate. So I just ask for your consideration if you would please increase RM5, increase our CD45 to 12 meters, change the definition of what a half story is to include up to 70% of the floor space of the floor below. Thank you very much for your consideration. And I have young kids who I've been told I need to help get to bed, so I will be watching the rest of you this evening from my phone at home. Thank you.
Thank you for coming forward, and we will speak to that under 13A. I'll call for a final time if there's anyone wishing to come forward this evening. Seeing none, I'll close the public. Oh, there we go. Please come forward, take your time. Hello.
Good evening. My name is Sarah Waddington. I live at 9972 3rd Street. So my request is, since tenants in Sydney are negatively affected by aggressive buyouts and speculative developments, I would request the town of Sydney expedite the creation of a tenant protection bylaw as mandated by the recent passing of Bill 16. The city of Burnaby has been a successful example in the creation of such a tenant protection plan, which allows residents displaced by redevelopment to remain in their communities and at their previous rents with the guarantee of first right of refusal in new developments. This is a proven way in which we can protect renters from speculative developments that would otherwise displace them in what is an unaffordable rental market for many people. Thank you.
Thank you for coming forward. Seeing no further speakers, I will close public participation. I might ask staff if we could just turn off the mic. We understand it sometimes interferes with the microphone system. And we're now turning to item 5 on our agenda. We have a number of bylaws. The first, actually we're taking the 3 bylaws together under 5A, 5B, and 5C. We will move recommendations separately, but it has a single staff report because bylaws are connected. And they are Bylaw number 2276, Patio Regulation, Bylaw number 2277, Bylaw Notice Enforcement, Amendment number 2, and Bylaw number 2278, Municipal Ticket Information, Amendment number 3. And I would turn to staff for an introduction, please. Good evening, Ms. Clary.
Good evening. Updates to the Sidewalk Café Bylaw have been an outstanding item since the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in emergency amendments to the bylaw to allow more outdoor eating space. Staff reviewed other bylaws in the region and found that much of the City of Victoria's patio bylaw would be suitable for Sydney. The most fundamental proposed change from the existing Sidewalk Café bylaw is to allow semi-permanent structures within the town's right-of-way. Under the current bylaw, all fixtures, tables, and chairs are supposed to be removed each evening after the business is closed for business. So tables and chairs are not actually supposed to be out on the town's right-of-way after businesses are closed in the evening. This new bylaw would allow businesses, the proposed bylaw would allow businesses to put more permanent structures in place that could be left up through the evening, and therefore make more of an investment into the space to make it a more vibrant and inviting space for individuals. So the new bylaw would allow both simple patios, which are similar to the existing style of patio in Sydney, where tables and chairs are to be removed each night, and complex patios, which would permit semi-permanent structures to be in place. There's a number of other changes. For example, our current bylaw does not permit any liquor sales within patio space, and so this new bylaw would. It makes a permission for some heating elements as long as it goes through the proper approvals, and there are a number of other changes recommended. Along with these changes, as the mayor mentioned, are also bylaw amendments to the ticketing systems, which are the Bylaw Notice Enforcement Bylaws and the Municipal Ticket Information Bylaw. The bylaw notice enforcement bylaw, when it came forward a couple years ago, did not actually include a table for the streets and traffic bylaw as well. So that is being brought forward at this time as a housekeeping item. And I'm here to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Clary. Before going to resolutions, I'll turn to council members if they have any questions of staff on any of the three bylaws. And I'll first turn to Councillor O'Keefe and then go to Councillor Novick.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to staff. So that additional space provided to businesses allows them to generate a significant more income, obviously, if they have more tables. I was talking to a business owner recently, and they were saying that when they have the opportunity to have a table out on a sidewalk with their stuff, they can sometimes boost their income by about $1,000 a day. So it's significant having access to that space. So given that, I'm wondering whether staff gave any consideration to charging a fee that was more in line with commercial rates for retail or restaurant space, maybe with some provision given if it's deemed to be seasonal.
Through to Councillor O'Keefe, staff did look at a revised fee mechanism, which is included in the staff report. So for a simple patio, at this time, we only charge $50 a year for the patio space. So we didn't want to make too much of an increase for the simple patio structure. So there is a slight increase for simple patios to $100 for the annual fee plus a $50 application fee. So it's going, if a business, again, this is just for food vending businesses, if they were to get the same patio license next year, they would be paying $150 per year instead of $50. And then we also provided a per square foot fee for complex patios. We have different rates for the downtown area, which is defined as the downtown commercial area in the OCP, and outside of downtown. So the rates picked there are really the lowest rates that were found in the City of Victoria's bylaw. We figured we would see how it goes and we could adjust them later on. It is quite a significant jump though from the current $50 a year, which businesses are currently paying.
Yeah, and I get to, just to follow up, if I may, do we have any sense of, I know you looked at what Victoria is charging, but in terms of regular commercial rates, do we have any idea what that, like I had heard just anecdotally, maybe $40 a square foot per month is what a business would normally pay. I don't know how accurate that is.
No, I didn't compare this to like a private business. It was compared to what like a parking space size, what a construction company would pay per day for if they were to remove a parking space from use. So that comparison is noted in the staff report.
Okay, good. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to staff. With regard to the complex patio and the nature of semi-permanent structures, there's no definition of that in the bylaw, and I'm just curious because once those types of patios are built out, they kind of become permanent, not really semi-permanent. So is there a conflict there? I mean, I'm all for it. I think they should have it. I'm just a bit concerned about how the language is stated.
Through to Councillor Novick, yes, we understand your concern. However, in public space, we can't permanently lease out space to private businesses, which is why they are semi-permanent. We may require a business to remove it at any time if we needed to do work within the municipal right-of-way, or if they also don't renew their license, they would be required to remove their element. So even though, yes, they could leave it there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so it is permanent in a sense. We're using the term semi-permanent because they may have to remove it quickly if required for any other reason.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Duck.
Yes, sir, if I may, through you, Mayor, to staff. Just to be clear, I think we have a quick count, about a dozen cafes and that are holding outdoor patios. Is this a way of trying to standardize how we manage them? Because I'm sure there are some that don't remove everything at night and some that are permanent, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Through to Councillor Duck, you may have noticed that we don't really enforce patios off business hours. So it more is to give businesses an opportunity if they did want to install some sort of fencing around a patio. For example, there was a business that came forward and they wanted to more formalize their patio, but we don't actually have a mechanism in our current bylaw to allow them to do that. There are a number around town that are supposed to be removed each night and, you know, are not, and this will actually give them the ability to legally do that.
Thank you. And as noted, I say some of those are on private property and some are on public property. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, if we can turn to 5A, bylaw number 2276, which the Patio Regulation Bylaw, which is a new bylaw. We can proceed, Council, by giving motions for first, second, and third reading. Councillor Novak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will move that the bylaw number 2276 be given first reading. I guess we have to do each one individually. So first reading.
Councillor Duck is giving second reading. We have discussion at second reading, so I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries. Councillor Novak?
And I will move that bylaw number 2276 be given second reading.
Moved by Councillor Novak, seconded by Councillor Duck. This is time for discussion. I'll turn to Councillor Keith.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I'll just proceed with perhaps a motion to launch discussion, if
Okay,
that's...
so we have a motion on the floor. It would be an amendment.
Yes, okay. So actually, I have a few. I'll go one by one. So the first one is that the option to use parking spaces for patio space be removed from the bylaw.
We have it moved by Councillor O'Keefe and seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the mover and seconder for motivation.
Thank you. So when I initially looked at this, I thought, oh, this is a cool idea, provide vibrancy and things to the downtown core. However, I'm not in favor of using the parking spaces because the number one concern we always get is about the lack of parking in downtown Sydney. So I have a concern about taking an additional 2 spaces off of each block to have for patio space. The other thing is that we've talked about through our parking study and in other conversations about adding more accessible parking in the future. Perhaps we're starting to use parking spaces for bike racks, which I think is a good thing. We also have got to look into adding some loading zones. So I'm concerned about the loss of future parking from those things as well. This is something that is not really needed. I think it's a nice to have, but I think it will adversely affect businesses in the area. I know that staff said that as part of the application process that they would consult a cafe or restaurant that wants to use that parking space would have to consult with their businesses, I presume, on either side. But downtown parking applies not just to those people that are beside them, but to the whole Beacon area. So it affects all downtown businesses. I think it was a good idea during COVID when businesses were really struggling. There was social distancing in place, and so they had to spread out. But at this point in time, that need is no longer there. While it's a nice to have, I think on balance in terms of the impact it will have on downtown parking, and that's why I don't support that particular aspect of it. Still okay with the sidewalk aspect, but just not using the parking spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Duck, the seconder.
Yes, I concur, and I think that we should keep those avenues open for, as Councillor O'Keefe has suggested, for bicycle parking and accessible and loading zones, and not take away from that. As we all are well aware, parking is one of the main proponents of issues we have within the community. I also think that our width of our current sidewalks, especially on Beacon, provide enough space for those cafes to operate, and they have over the past number of years been able to do that. As it is a revenue generating mechanism for the cafe, I don't think we should sacrifice parking for increased revenue to those businesses when they already have access to enough sidewalk to do that. And so I'm not in favor of continuing to provide or to add any parking or to provide any parking that's taken away from our parking accommodations to allow for larger businesses on the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Novick.
I don't support this. I think the number of businesses that would apply for and use all 2 parking spaces would be very small. I think what I'm hearing is that we're talking about Beacon. I think having patios that extend onto the street in limited areas add to the vibrancy of Beacon. We are trying to achieve a pedestrian feel for the downtown area. Having more cars on Beacon rather than less cars, I don't think is a good thing. I think there are plenty of people right now that that park on the side streets, and I'm sure that will continue. The numbers involved are so small in terms of the number of parking spaces that would be removed that I don't think that that outweighs what having restaurants or pub patios out into the street brings to the area in terms of it being A, pedestrian friendly, B, vibrant, and builds on the activity in the street and makes it a more friendly and accessible space for everyone, and just helps to make downtown Sydney core a more interesting and attractive place, both for tourists and for residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. Along with Councillor Novick, I will vote against this motion for, it's not that I disagree that these spaces, we would like to have them used for bike parking and loading zones, but simply that I think that this, if we removed this, we would introduce some unfairness between the different businesses. As staff have pointed out, because of the different widths of sidewalks in certain parts of town, we already know that the very first patio that we approved during COVID was in fact in front of a business where they required going into that parking space because they had such a narrow piece of sidewalk there and they needed to have that ramp. And so I can predict that there will be some businesses where unless they can use, you know, some of a parking space or part of that, we might be cutting off their access. Secondly, I think, as Councillor Novak said, having some, you know, reducing cars on Beacon is one of our kind of goals, and is part of a, you know, like a traffic calming and creating more pedestrian friendly and bike friendly space. If we do have some limited number and more along the Beacon Avenue, that does disincentivize people using it as a driving corridor, and perhaps have them go around, you know, another block and spread out the parking demand. And perhaps that will induce some people to use maybe part of a parking spot, maybe for more of these bike corrals. We know that the places that have the bike corrals that have been placed in a parking spot have done so kind of in places where there's already a bump out, or in places where there's been redevelopment such that there are those bump outs and those wider sidewalks, and those are kind of areas where it feels more natural to have those bikes. And so I think having sidewalk cafes does seem to make that a more natural transition, and we've seen that in downtown Victoria as well. So I think that this, allowing that flexibility, will allow businesses to maybe actually do some of those alternate uses of these spaces, of parking spaces that support those other things we think they might compete with.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I won't support it either. Although I see both sides of the argument, but for me, it's if we can have the patio in the parking space as opposed to on the sidewalk, if possible, and just leave the sidewalk space available for all the different methods of transportation we have in our community. I think that makes for a more seamless use of the space. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. I'll turn to Councillor Renewal.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you to colleagues. I think it's an important discussion, and I'm pleased that we're giving this significant consideration. I'm inclined to support the amendment that's been put forward, and I say so only because I have some concerns, despite I recognize, staff have indicated that the use of a parking space as a patio would come with the requirements to ensure the health and safety of the public who are using it, which means, appropriate barricades, etc. But I'm a little, I guess, cautious to see us go down this path further from a liability perspective, and I can't help but have some ongoing concern, despite the interests. I know that staff will look to protect the town's interests in this matter, whether or not encouraging patrons, to be seated in a parking area immediately next to a busy roadway, where members of the public are often maneuvering their vehicles to utilize adjacent parking. I'm a little concerned that we may not be there yet in terms of sort of mitigating use of vehicles to encourage parking spaces to be used in this manner. So I'll continue to listen, but I am inclined to support the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Renewal. I'll speak for a first time. And
just point of information.
Well, there is no point of information.
Okay, but just for clarification, again, just on Councillor Garnett's point that if somebody's using those two parking spots, they won't be using the
okay,
sidewalk.
so I'll take you as a second-time speaker, Councillor Duck. So speaking for a first time, I'm in support of the amendment for a number of reasons. First is that the use of parking spaces for patios came during the pandemic. And we saw it, many instances of it, particularly in downtown Victoria. And we provided those amendments to our sidewalk bylaw during the pandemic, and we did have 2 or 3 instances of businesses utilizing that. And I was fully supportive of it at that time, because restaurants and cafes were amongst the hardest hit during the pandemic in terms of having to social distance or what they were permitted in terms of their premises, indoor premises. And it is true that the City of Victoria has continued to allow patios in parking spaces in certain cases within their bylaws. Staff have indicated in their report and in their introduction this evening. However, we do have a number of restaurants and cafes who do have patios in the public right of way on the sidewalks, and I think it does add significantly to the vibrancy of our downtown. I understand, and this is a question through to staff in the report, that if a business was to request having a patio on the sidewalk in front of their business and then having it in front of the parking stall, they would be permitted to do that. They would be permitted to have a patio on the sidewalk in front of their business, and also be permitted, if they applied, to have a parking space, subject to the limitations of 2 parking spaces per block.
Correct, if there was adequate space for both.
So there are instances in the downtown and elsewhere where a business could have a patio on the sidewalk and taking a parking space as well. And quite frankly, I think the general public would find that excessive. I think the public is generally supportive of businesses, restaurants and cafes having their patio space on the sidewalk, but I think if they saw them having them on the sidewalk and taking a parking space, there might be some reaction to that. I would prefer to have input from the downtown business community on this. We do know from the parking study that was done that the highest turnover of our highest usage of our parking spaces in the downtown is on Beacon Avenue. In the blocks, various blocks of Beacon Avenue from 5th Street down to the waterfront, there is, I believe, either 10 or 8 cars that are typically parking at a time in those blocks. And those, as a business owner for the past 24 years, I can tell you that those Beacon Avenue parking spots turn over. Not every parking spot, but many of those parking spots turn over a number of times within an hour. So it's not just one person parking there in an hour, it could be several. And so taking 2 out of 8 parking spaces in one of the blocks is a 25% reduction on Beacon Avenue. And patrons appreciate, particularly our demographic with 45% of our population 65 or older, having that accessibility. So I appreciate that there is some benefit, but I think given the downtown urban streetscape design features that the town has been incorporating, which we see at Beacon and 4th and we see elsewhere, I think our downtown was vibrant before and it's even more vibrant now with what has been provided. We also look at the other uses of parking spaces. I fully support the bicycle use. We see on 4th Street and Beacon Avenue that one of the parking spaces was turned into a little planting garden, and I can be supportive of that. But seeing up to 2 parking spaces in each of the blocks taken up for patio space, I think would, in the 5 blocks, those 5 blocks of the main street, and whatever it was on the side streets or Bevan and Sydney Avenue would have an impact. So I will support the amendment at this time. I'll now turn to second-time speakers. Councillor Duck, if you wish.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the clarification on it's not an either-or parking spot or sidewalk patio. They can have up to both, and so that's my concern, is that it's that overuse of the area. So I remain supportive of this amendment to not allow parking spots to be utilized for cafe space. Thank you.
I'll turn if there is any second-time speakers. Other second-time speakers, Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the Mayor brought up a very important point during his discussion, and that is that perhaps we should find a way to consult with the business community on Beacon, and I would suggest that if we did, there would be widespread approval for the bylaw as it is written. I don't think that having more cars on Beacon helps to improve the business of the merchants on Beacon Street. I know that there are some people that want to be able to park right in front of the store that they're going to. But I think in the long run, and the reality is that if people can park near Beacon Street, they're going to be walking to and fro. I think having those types of patios where the streetscape is broken up by an interesting patio for an interesting restaurant or pub really adds to the attractiveness of the street. And I don't think that that the loss, and there's no guarantee that those losses would be real. The bylaw says up to 2, and there has to be consultation with the neighbors. I doubt that we would get 10 of these cafes, which would limit the parking on all 10 of the block street sides. So for those reasons, I would still like to oppose this amendment. I don't think that it overly prejudices the commerces on the street, while it does add to the streetscape and it adds to the attractiveness of Beacon. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. Seeing no, sorry, I'm going to turn to Ms. Clary.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify, much of the discussion is about the downtown area and specifically Beacon. Was this motion for the outside of downtown area as well, where sidewalks are much more narrow than Beacon Avenue, or is it for the whole town?
I'll turn to the mover. I would take the motion to include the downtown as it was moved in a general way, but I'll turn to the mover and seconder for intent.
Yeah, I think,
Microphone, Councillor.
I would say just for the downtown area, that's, I think, where it's mainly a concern.
Okay, so the downtown business district is understood to be from the highway to the waterfront, Sydney Avenue, Beacon Avenue, Bevan Avenue, and the side streets.
Yes,
That's your intent?
yes.
And the seconder was concurring on that. Thank you, Ms. Clary. Did you have a further comment or just sought that clarification? Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question on the amendment. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novak, Councillor Gurnett, and Councillor Duncan opposed the motion. The amendment does carry. So the motion is amended. Councillor O'Keefe, you indicated you might have other amendments.
Yes, thank you. So my second proposed amendment is that the 3-meter unobstructed accessible walkway be maintained for Beacon Avenue.
Do we have a seconder? I will second for discussion. Councillor O'Keefe?
Yes, so I think Beacon is our main street, should continue to be wide and accessible, the sidewalks for everybody. I don't see that there's a reason to change this just because a restaurant wants to squeeze in a couple tables and they can't because there's a planter in the way, and so we have to restrict mobility for our population. I just don't think it's a good idea. I think we should continue to maintain that 3 meters. Also, as we know, as the mayor mentioned, we have a population, elderly population. A lot of them use mobility devices and that sort of thing. So, and in busy times, it gets really, can get really congested. So I see no advantage to, you know, making it narrower just to accommodate a business here or there. And I think I said that was just for Beacon Avenue. So for other areas, that might be more suitable, but not for our main street. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. As a seconder, I'll speak and speak in favor of the amendment. I feel Beacon Avenue is our busiest pedestrian walkway by far, and that I can appreciate why staff brought it forward. They provided the rationale in the report. There are some businesses that they don't have the full double-wide sidewalk in front of them, and so they may be less able to put out a patio or patio tables than other businesses. But quite frankly, you know, businesses rent their space. You know, either they own their space or they rent it from their landlord, and they intend to operate there. I think it's a bonus or a plus that for most of the businesses, most of the restaurants and cafes, they do have the opportunity to have, if they don't already have a private patio, which several businesses do in the downtown, that they are able to use the public right of way. So I think it's important for pedestrian flow and for accessibility to for all mobility types in our downtown to maintain that 3-foot space in the downtown. Councillor Gannett, then Councillor Duncan.
I won't support the amendment, and it's actually tied to the fact that we just made an amendment that doesn't allow parking spaces to be used, and so there may be instances where it's not even viable space-wise for some of these establishments to even have a patio anymore. So it kind of defeats the purpose of even having the bylaw. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gannett. Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you said 3 feet, it's 3 meters.
I'm sorry.
So, yeah, so 1.5 meters is 4 feet, which is what the lowest currently is, which I'm okay with. We have narrower sidewalks elsewhere in town. I think that this is one of the ones where they increased it during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's kind of the key phrase there, I think, to understand why this was taken away, because that was when we had a government required social distancing of 2 meters. And so this wasn't put in place specifically because of actual concerns about traffic flow or accessibility or anything. This was about making sure we had a government regulated distance between people that was very, very wide, and wider than we actually technically need for current pedestrian flows and current accessibility. So I'm okay with taking this away because we no longer have this requirement to make sure that people stay 2 meters apart from each other, and that's why that's being removed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call a question on the amendment. Those in favor? Those opposed? Councillor Duncan, Councillor Gurnett, Councillor Novick, and Councillor Rintoul. The amendment is defeated. I'll turn the floor back to you, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. So one more, that the bylaw be referred back to staff to consider an increase in the license fees for sidewalk patio licenses that are more in line with market rates for space.
Do we have a seconder?
Second for discussion.
Councillor Duncan, I'll turn to the mover and seconder.
Thank you. So So during COVID, it made sense to offer up this space to businesses at, I don't think we charged them anything, or if it was very, very nominal fee. Because social distancing requirements were in place. They were suffering financially, so it was a way for them to get more customers in and stay afloat. However, that's passed now. Businesses were pretty well back to normal. And so although staff have indicated that they've raised the rate, what we're doing here is we're providing really cheap real estate to businesses to expand their footprint. And I have concerns about having a level playing field for all businesses, so that to have such a significant additional space added to their business, they get the opportunity to provide, to earn additional income, which is a good thing, but not all businesses in downtown Sydney are going to get that opportunity. So if another type of store wants to say, hey, I'd like to have some extra space too. As I said earlier, the example of a business that they can put out a table with their stuff and they can make an extra $1,000 a day in additional income. So I have concern about the level playing field, and that we are giving an advantage to some businesses without providing asking for any compensation for that. It's not a level playing field, and I think we're giving an unfair advantage to those businesses by offering them such a cheap way to expand their footprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor Duck.
If I may, Your Mayor, just to clarify through to staff, the current license or fee that we charge for patios, is that similar or the same to other communities in the Capital Regional District?
Through to Councillor Duck, an extensive comparison of other municipalities wasn't done. However, as mentioned, the per square foot rate that's in our bylaw is the lowest for the city, the lowest rate out of a number of rates that the city of Victoria is using. And they actually are proposing significant increases in 2025 and ongoing years to that rate as well. That was really just to get businesses going.
Thank you. That helps clarify, because we have a basis for which it's now generating that, and obviously we'll be monitoring, staff will be monitoring other communities to see how that goes, and I think staff indicated that may be the initial point, and it may be increased in future years as to what's more common within the community. So I'm in favor of having staff take a look at this to see if it's reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not in favor of this. We just took away the parking spaces from the patios. So the possibility of these large fees coming back to the town for these patios is now gone. The amount of space on the sidewalks that would be used as patio would be relatively small. The fees, therefore, coming back to the town would be relatively small. We have to remember as well that we don't charge for business licenses anymore. We got rid of that to try and encourage businesses and to facilitate, longevity for businesses on the street. So I'm not sure why charging higher fees for a patio is going to make that much of a difference to the town. I think it's also worth knowing that the type of business that would be using these patios would typically be bars and restaurants. And it's well known that bars and restaurants have some of the lowest operating margins of any business on the planet. It's very difficult for these guys to make enough money to remain in business over the long haul. So I think that anything we can do to facilitate that is absolutely necessary, and I think the fees that have been proposed are quite reasonable. If they are to go up over time, I think that is reasonable as well. but I don't see that there's a need to send this back to staff now to look at higher fees. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. I'll turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I also oppose this motion. I won't repeat what Councillor Novak said, but definitely underline it. Not only are restaurants a low margin business, but they have not had their pressures reduced since the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that large proportions, double-digit percentages of restaurants are still continuing to go out of business because costs have gone up so much for supplies, labor is short, and commercial rentals have still continued to go up. Like, the cost increases on these businesses have hit them disproportionately, though they hit everybody. But food is a really big one, fuel. So since the town has no need to recoup costs from this or make money from this for the operation of our town, I see no reason to try to put in extra fees when we know that we would actually prefer to have businesses that remain viable, and having these patios may actually, for some businesses, be the difference between remaining viable for the next couple of years and not. That I would prefer to keep them low. As pointed out earlier, we may revisit these fees in 2 to 3 years, and I had a note actually earlier to ask staff if we needed a motion, but I suspect we don't need one. I suspect this would be something that would simply come out. If we need to increase the fees for some reason because staff is finding, we have more cleaning or something associated with that, then we will do that then. But to start out assuming that we need to make these higher, I do not support that at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I see no other speakers. I will speak and speak in support of the motion. We're veering into a discussion as to whether or not businesses are viable and how much they make or what their margins are, and that really doesn't pertain to our discussion. We'll remember that the Local Government Act and the Community Charter stipulate that municipalities are not to provide assistance to business. And so what I think is reasonable is, given that businesses that are using the public right-of-way, that are using the space in the right-of-way, are using increased space. And in essence, what they're doing is they're paying rent for it. And the question is what is the appropriate rent for those businesses to pay for the space that they are using to earn sales? And what is reasonable is something approximating a market rate. Councillor O'Keefe has spoken earlier that whatever a reasonable market rate is, you would consider reducing it substantially because the public space, outdoor space, is not as usable as the indoor space. But most businesses can operate, or most restaurants, I believe, can operate on their patios more than half the year. So even if it was half of the square footage rate. So staff have done a calculation for semi-permanent patios of, they did a calculation, but I think it should be based on market rents, and staff have indicated that it's not. It's based on the lowest amount that the City of Victoria is currently charging. They already have different rates, and they're going to be increasing all of their rates. So I think we should be not relating it to what the rates are in Victoria, because I can tell you, as a business owner, that the rents are higher in Victoria than they are in Sydney, and that it should be market based. The other thing I'm not supportive of is I'm not supporting not charging those rates for a simple patio license. So we understood in the definitions that the staff have provided that a simple patio license is for those restaurants, cafes that have movable furniture, tables and chairs that they can move if they wish inside overnight. We've heard that some of them don't, and this bylaw will permit them to keep them there overnight. Versus businesses with semi-permanent. The semi-permanent being, guess what? Those tables and chairs and maybe some other semi-permanent fixtures will be there as well. What's the difference? They're occupying the same space and they're occupying the space at the same time. There is no difference in terms of simple and complex patios. They're using that space, and I believe the same, as they're earning the same revenue or have the same revenue opportunities, they should be charged the same rates. So I'll leave my comments there, but again, refer to the requirement by the Local Government Act that we not be seen to be providing assistance to business. I'll turn to Councillor Renewal for first time and then go to second time speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Again, I think we've had a fulsome discussion on this, and I hope if someone's speaking a second time, it's not to be repetitive, would be my suggestion. Look, utilization of this space, I don't see it as a benefit to the business from the standpoint, you know, that the mayor has raised that as a concern, and yes, we need to be wary of that. But look, I think we've heard from other speakers that this creates a vibrancy in the town. And so where I had concerns about using parking spaces, perhaps for liability reasons in this instance, you know, I see it as an exciting opportunity for the town, for Beacon Avenue to be able to add, you know, some color, some vibrancy. It's costly for any business to utilize this space at any rate, whether it is the installations that would be required to make it usable, whether it is the staffing to make it practical to utilize this space. So at this point, I'm not in favor of the amended motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Toole. And I'll turn to any second-time speakers if they have new points to make. Councillor Novak.
I just have one point. I'm a little concerned about the comparison of these fees with rent. As we all know, when a business rents space inside a building, the majority of that rental goes to A, capital cost, or reducing the capital cost of the building, B, the maintenance of the building, and C, providing some profit for the owner. None of those are applicable in the case of a patio. The town is not renting the space. This is a fee for use. I think it's a very different thing, and I think it's dangerous to make that comparison. It just doesn't work, and it's not even comparable. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing alternative mover, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Just some points of clarification. So when we talked about charging, I'm not presuming that we would charge the same rate that we would for normal rent. And I think the mayor alluded to that, is that it would be a rate that would be somewhat reduced. And it's not about, there's comments made about the amount of money that we would gain from this would be nominal. So it's not about bringing, grabbing cash from businesses in order to increase our corporate coffers. It's more about being fair to all businesses, because not all businesses are going to have the opportunity to do this. So for me, that's more what it's about. It's about respecting what's in the Local Government Act in terms of the municipality not providing any significant benefit to some businesses and not others. So that's kind of where it lands for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no further discussion, I'll call the question. Those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? We have Councillor Novak, Councillor Gurnett, Councillor Duncan, and Councillor Rintoul. Opposed. The motion is defeated. Councillor O'Keefe, you indicated you...
One last one.
Please go ahead.
That the bylaw be referred to SPAC for their review and comment.
Okay, just before I look for a seconder, we're at second reading. I'll turn to staff. If this motion were to pass, we'd refer it to SPAC after second reading, and then it would come back for third reading, and then a separate and then separately for adoption. Mr. Humble?
That's correct.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder on the motion to refer to SPAC?
Second for discussion.
Councillor Duck, alternative mover and seconder.
Well, this is something that obviously has implications for accessibility, and I know that there's mention in the staff report about accessible standards and that sort of thing. But what I always find out from the people at SPAC is that there's often things that we just don't think about in terms of how patios are structured, where equipment is, or fixtures are laid out, tables, chairs, that sort of thing. So I think it's a good idea to at least get their input in terms of any things that we should be mindful of in moving forward with this. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to turn back to staff procedurally. So we have the main motion on the floor under second reading to give second reading. We haven't yet voted on giving second reading. We've been considering amendments. This is a referral motion. A referral motion leaves the main motion on the floor and is referring it elsewhere to come back. So that's appropriate in this case. We don't have to conclude second reading before referring it.
You don't. You can refer it to SPAC and then bring it back, and then depending,
We then continue with second reading.
with the amendments, and then go to second reading, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to check that procedurally. I'll turn to Councillor, sorry, Councillor O'Keefe, you had the floor.
Yes, thank you. And I was just gonna say, we had some email traffic with SPAC on this earlier today, and there was concern about potential delay because next SPAC meeting isn't for 2 months. SPAC has the option to call a meeting at any time. So if time is of the essence, that's something that could be done if staff are wanting to move on this more quickly.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. Councillor Duncan, if I might turn to the seconder first.
No, nothing to add.
Thank you. Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just wondering if this needs to actually be part of a referred, so that this bylaw doesn't go, stops at second reading today. Just looking at staff's comments on, they may wish to refer to the Saanich Peninsula or to SPAC, but right now it's only just because they have this accessibility feature in the definitions. But they do talk about having to have a separate guide, and it seems almost like it might be more appropriate to refer the guide rather than the bylaw, so that SPAC has the ability to help them with the guide about how the patios go. Because I'm not sure if what they're actually would be giving feedback on would be helpful at the level of the bylaw versus the guide that talks about what's in there. So that might be, maybe I'll ask staff.
Could you direct it through to staff?
Direct through to staff, whether they think that would be more helpful or at this point.
Ms. Clary or Mr. Hisik? Mr. Hisik.
Thank you. Generally, referrals to SPAC are better for the policy stuff, not individual applications, or in the case of this bylaw, there's no need for that referral to hold up this bylaw amendment. They can always come back with suggestions for improvement, but the process doesn't need to halt for that.
I feel like what he was saying was that it was better if we proceeded with the bylaw and then referred to SPAC for the creation of the guide. I guess.
Sorry, thank you, Councillor Duncan. You're doing the same as I wish to do, and that is seek clarification from Mr. Hisik. So, Mr. Hisik, we're at second reading. If this referral motion was to pass, we would hold approving second reading. It would go to SPAC, come back, and we'd continue. Are you suggesting that we perhaps continue through third reading this evening and then refer it, or refer it at a later date?
Yes, I'm suggesting that the bylaw be dealt with and it be referred for, policy and guideline comments at a later time, but without putting a halt to this proceeding of adopting the bylaw.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So if we were to proceed with through to third reading this evening, at our next council meeting, give adoption and then refer it, if SPAC made recommendations, we would be seeking to amend the bylaw if council saw merit in SPAC recommendations. I'm seeing nods. So Councillor Duncan, you did have the floor.
Thank you. I guess I was simply going to follow up because they had mentioned about, it sounds like the kind of detail SPAC would be providing would be appearing in a guide to patios. And I don't know if they would even be providing feedback on the bylaw itself, but rather working with staff to something that wouldn't even be coming back to council until a later, or wouldn't need to come back to council. I'm not.
Sorry, if staff could clarify Councillor Duncan's point.
So at this time, a complete patio guide hasn't been fully developed. We have ideas for it. We're working on it, but it really, the intent of it is that it's an internal working document for staff to follow as new applications come in. If that was a desire of council, we could bring it to SPAC at a future date. However, referring this bylaw will also provide comments that might feed into that guide. So I don't think we would need to refer both. If you did want to refer the bylaw, by all means, go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to turn back to the mover in terms of, you've heard comments from staff in terms of
Yeah,
process?
and so I think the point is well taken that I don't think SPAC necessarily needs to review the whole bylaw. The important thing is for them to look at if there's going to be a patio guide that's developed, if there's kind of design standards, or how are these things going to be laid out. That's kind of more what they would be interested in looking at. And since that guide hasn't been yet designed, then it seems to make sense to move forward past the bylaw. And then I would perhaps make a motion arising to refer to SPAC to review and provide comment on those aspects of, you know, the patio guide, or other issues that they may bring up. Because as I said before, if we just say, look
Okay,
at the.
but don't
Okay.
let's not motivate.
Okay,
You're covering procedures, so.
so do you want me to?
So I would suggest, Councillor, that you seek to remove,
Sure.
withdraw your referral motion.
Okay, I'll withdraw that motion.
And the seconder is in agreement? Okay, so we're back to second reading. Is there any, and Councillor O'Keefe, you said you'd concluded your amendments. Was there any other discussion or amendments at second reading? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Of second reading, as amended? That carries unanimous. And if we could have a mover and seconder for third reading, moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novick. There's no discussion at third reading. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe, if you wish to make a motion arising?
Yes, that the patio guide standards or be.
Patio guide is good.
Patio guidance be referred to SPAC for their comment.
Further comments back to staff? It doesn't need to come back to council. I'm seeing an agreement on that, so.
Yeah.
That the patio guide be referred to SPAC for comments back to staff. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Duck. Any discussion? Seeing none. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you. So we're now turning to bylaw number 2277, bylaw notice enforcement, amendment number 2. Again, we need to proceed through first, second, and third reading. I would look for a mover, Councillor Duck, a seconder, Councillor Novick. We don't have discussion. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. We have the same mover and seconder for second reading. I'm seeing that. Any discussion? This would be the time. Councillor O'Keefe?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I haven't had a chance to look through this in light of the change that we made, that we're no longer offering space in parking spaces. And so is there anything in these last two bylaws that need to be adjusted based on that?
I would turn to staff. Ms. Clary?
Through to Councillor O'Keefe, no, the fee structure or the fine structure just refers to patio. It doesn't refer to roadside or sidewalk patio.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Any further discussion at second reading? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. I have the same mover and seconder for third reading. I do. No discussion. All in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. And we're turning to the third bylaw under 5C. Bylaw number 2278, Municipal Ticket Information Bylaw, Amendment number 3. If I could have a mover and seconder, Councillor Duck, Councillor Novick. All in favor? Motion carries. And then same mover and seconder for second reading. Thank you. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all in favor? Motion carries unanimous. And the same mover and seconder for third reading, I see. All in favor? That motion carries. Thank you. Thank you, Council. We're now turning to development permits and development variance permits. Under 6A, we have development variance permit application number DV 100356 at 2461 Beacon Avenue, Bank of Montreal, to increase the number of fascia signs permitted on the north building face and to reduce the vertical distance from the ground for a fascia sign to allow for one additional fascia sign to be installed on the north side of the building. We have no written submissions received as of this evening. Council, we did discuss this at the previous meeting. We did amend the application, so this is the amended application that we're seeking to approve this evening, and that is the staff recommendation. Do I have a mover? Councillor O'Keefe, go ahead.
I'll move that the development variance permit be approved.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. Any discussion? Seeing Councillor Novick.
Thank you. I don't agree with this. I had a close look at that building. I've looked at other buildings on Beacon and on the side streets. I think the need for additional signage is, I don't see the justification. If we go ahead with this, then every building that has a ground floor space and maybe some second floor offices is going to want additional signage. I think it's quite obvious from the way the building is designed and laid out, and with the existing signage there, I think it's quite obvious that the Bank of Montreal has the entire building. And I hesitate to change our signage bylaw like this, because I think it sets a dangerous precedent. It's a thin edge of the wedge, and we'll start to get a flurry, I feel, of requests to increase signage on buildings. I can remember it wasn't long ago we rejected a sign on a new development on the waterfront that was going to be on the roof because they had signage further down. I don't see this as being terribly different. I just don't feel that the justification is there, and I'm just afraid that it defeats the entire purpose of having that signage bylaw in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. Seeing no further speakers, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Novick is opposed. The motion carries. It is adopted. We're now turning to item 7, which is adoption of minutes. I would look for a mover and seconder that the minutes of our special council meeting on May 13th and the minutes from our regular council meeting of May 13th be adopted. Moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor O'Keefe. Any corrections? Seeing none, all in favor? The motion carries. Thank you. We have no business under 8, 9, or 10. We're turning to number 11, council reports, and I'll turn to Councillor Garnett for his report on the Sydney Museum and Archives.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief and try to be expeditious given what's still on the agenda ahead. Attended the latest board meeting for the Sydney Museum and Archives on May 18th. And buoyed by the excellent Lego visitation, the visitor total as of April 30th was just over 14,600, which is almost 1,200 more visitors than they had in the entire year of 2023. So it was very, very successful. And consequently, financially, the museum is in good shape. Visitor donations as of April 30th, just over $56,000, and a net income of just under $35,000. But it's important to note that the start of the year is always their strong point, and the visitorship and donations tend to dwindle down as the year goes on, so it's important for them to be in these really good financial positions at this point in the season or year. Very good progress has been made on the waterfront signage project, with work ongoing, and quite a bit has been done reaching out with the Saanich Leadership Council on the 3 panels that will be specific for them. A reminder that Lost Liberties, the War Measures Act exhibit is scheduled from August 5th to November 29th. And I will speak more to that as we approach it in council reports moving forward. And finally, I just want to mention that along with the mayor and other members of council, Councillor Novick, Councillor O'Keefe, and Councillor Duck, we all attended the opening of the current exhibit, Our Living Languages. On April 15th, Hereditary Chief Eric Pelkey and his son Elliot performed a blessing ceremony to officially open the exhibit. I myself feel incredibly fortunate to have been there. I found it to be quite moving. And I highly recommend that everyone visit the important exhibit, and if you have not already, it is an opportunity to gain both knowledge and perspective. And I would just highly recommend that you go see it. It's really worth it. And this exhibit runs until July 24th. So that's all I have for tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate the update, Councillor Garnett. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe, who has an update on Accessibility Week.
Yes, so National Accessibility Week runs from now until Saturday. So just want to highlight a bit of general info about accessibility. The 2022 census shows that almost 1/3 of people in BC over the age of 15 have at least one disability, and that was up by about 4% compared to the last census. 70% of persons with disabilities reported having encountered some form of barrier to accessibility within the last year. Persons with disabilities also experience extreme difficulty finding housing, employment, shopping can be a challenge, participating in community events and with transit. However, I think we're making good progress in Sydney, and I just wanted to highlight some of the things that have taken place in the last year in terms of accessibility. Council approved the Changing Places washroom, which will be added to our waterfront washrooms to accommodate persons with disabilities who have more complex needs. The Breather Park playground was redesigned to include a rubberized surface and more accessible play structures. We updated our logo to make it easier for persons with disabilities. Our website was redesigned and is now more compatible with screen readers that are used by persons with visual disabilities. Staff have made improvements to the sidewalks at Beacon and 4th and Beacon and 3rd. That makes it easier with persons who have mobility, physical disabilities, and visual disabilities to navigate those intersections. Staff, I understand, have just undergone accessibility training thanks to a grant from the provincial government. And many of the changes that we've made in the last year or so have been as a result of input from our community members on our accessibility advisory committee. So I'd like to acknowledge them. That's from Sydney, Tracy Poole, Vanessa Pettinger, David Ryder, Lee York, Charlene Froome from North Saanich, and David Willows from Central Saanich. I find they've really helped us get a better understanding of accessibility issues, and I continue to be amazed at just when I start to think that I'm understanding accessibility and some of the challenges, they always surprise me with something that I hadn't thought about. In regards to some events this week, so just a reminder that the Shoal Centre is holding its annual accessibility forum this Saturday from 10 to 2, and that's an event that's sponsored by the town, and that'll feature speakers and info and resources on accessibility. And Panorama Rec Centre also has some good resources on display as well, if you want to check those out. That's all for me. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. We appreciate the update on National Accessibility Week. We're now, we have no committee reports this evening under 12, so we're turning to Section 13, staff reports, and 13A is our Draft Zoning Bylaw 2275. We have a report on community engagement summary and next steps, and I will turn to Mr. Newcomb, our Director of Community Planning. Good evening, Mr. Newcomb.
Good evening. Hoping for better technological luck tonight. Seem to be working. Okay, so I'm here tonight to give a update on the zoning bylaw update project, summarizing the community engagement process that we've just undertaken, and to highlight some of the revisions to the draft of bylaw number 2275. So last time I was in front of you on this project, Council provided 4 resolutions to move the project forward. So the first was that staff go out and initiate community engagement on the draft bylaw and report back with the results. The second was that letters be sent to the property owners of lands to be designated as RM6R, the rental zoning, and invite them to provide feedback. The next was a council-initiated motion that directed staff to send notification to all property owners and occupants of lands in Sydney regarding the zoning bylaw changes. And then the last was to refer the draft bylaw to APC. So taking that direction, staff initiated community engagement. We had sort of a formalized period noted in engagement materials of April 26th to May 12th. It was a little more fluid than that. We did take comments before and after those dates, and some of those comments are included in the feedback tonight. So as per the third resolution here, staff began this period by sending out over 8,700 notices to all property owners and occupants in Sydney. Those arrived in mailboxes early in the week of April 29th. Following that, the next week, staff held 5 3-hour open houses here in council chambers from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. One information session was held at the Mary Winspear Centre from 4:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. Sandwich board signs were placed throughout the community to help raise awareness, along with advertisements in the Peninsula News Review, a news release, posters placed in key locations in Sydney, a social media campaign, and updates to the project webpage. And I just want to give a massive hat tip to Ms. Judson, who really spearheaded most of these initiatives here and freed me up to work on the bylaw itself. So what did we hear from the community as a result of all this work? From the open houses, we had about 180 people attend over the 5 days. The evening information session was packed with about 170 people, definitely a full house. From the 8,700 notices, we received about 50 written responses back with detailed comments on the draft bylaw. Staff held many in-depth discussions with members of the community over that engagement period, both in person at the open houses and information sessions, and here in the town hall over the phone and by email. And I won't go into the detailed responses, but the May 27 staff report addresses these. So based on all that feedback, what did we do to the draft? I'm going to read the bullet point first here. Generally overall, the main direction of the draft bylaw remains the same. So these changes didn't result in any major changes, I would say, to the approach in the draft bylaw. We did clarify some of the definitions as a result of some of the comments. Corrected probably more errors than there should have been, but the more times you look at a document, the more times those errors seem to escape you sometimes. The short-term rental regulation was updated to better align with recent provincial regulations. So one important change there is that the 31-day minimum currently in the bylaw is now 90 days. Proposed to be 90 days, similar to the provincial requirement. As I mentioned, the bylaw was referred to APC, and on May 7th, I presented to APC. We had a very fulsome conversation about the bylaw, lots of questions and answers and discussion, and APC made one recommendation to clarify the regulation around gas bars at service stations and where fuel can be stored. So that change has been made. More substantive changes to the draft. Not so many written comments on this, but we heard, I think, a lot in person from single-family homeowners in non-single-family zones, so the RM and M2 proposed zones, that they would like the option to install a secondary suite, maybe not now, but at some point in the future. So secondary suites has been added as a permitted use into those zones. We heard some concern from the development community about the costs involved with requiring underground parking in the downtown commercial or C1 zone. And we've taken those comments to heart, and we'll be looking at that at the future. But for now, we think it's better to remove that from the draft zoning bylaw. There was also some comments about the impact on building design and development costs as a result of the 3-bedroom requirement in apartment buildings. This is something we've heard from the development community for quite a few years, and this is an opportunity to address that. One thing we heard during the Summergate Village consultations last year was that the current land use bylaw provides for an open space concept in Summergate Village, so no fences or gates, and the residents very much wanted that carried forward. In the first draft, we neglected to put that regulation in the bylaw, but that has now been put in the landscape design section. We've added CD43 zone as a result of the recent rezoning of 2180 Beacon Avenue, and we've tried to update the zoning map to provide more clarity. So those aren't every single change to the draft bylaw, but they're some of the more substantial ones, and I'm happy to speak to any of the other ones in my staff report. Regarding the RM6R zone, or the rental zone, so we did send letters to the 13 property owners. That's Appendix A in the staff report, along with the 2 letters that we received in response. I would say that staff were aware of some of the concerns raised in those response letters, and the RM6R zone was developed understanding that those are some of the considerations involved in that zone. And I would say despite that, staff are still recommending to proceed with this zone. As I mentioned in the report, I think it's important to keep in mind that some of the buildings in these zones, in these properties, are definitely older buildings. And so there may be some near-term redevelopment applications there. And there's a process for that. If applications are received, they would go through that standard process. So next steps. Here we are with the red dot at the May 27th regular council meeting, reporting out on community engagement and recommending refinements to the draft bylaw. So at this point, with any final council directed adjustments, staff are ready to move to the bylaw adoption stage with the 2 meetings left in June. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. We appreciate the introduction and the slides as well to accompany that introduction. I've noted some of the questions that arose during public participation. I won't turn to those right away, but if council is aware that I will come to those, or we can come to those. But are there any questions of Mr. Newcomb at this time? Councillor Keefe.
I'm not sure if this was one of the ones you were going to raise. Sorry.
Microphone.
The request to allow seaweed cultivation, I presume that would be the W3 open water. So if we were to later request an amendment to include that, do you need anything more than to allow for seaweed cultivation or any other descriptor in regards to that?
Yeah, thanks through the mayor to Councillor O'Keefe. This has been discussed a few times over the last few years, and I think really it's one of those uses that staff would rather see come forward as a development application. There's a number of considerations with a use like this. I think the first is that staff are not overly familiar with that business in and of itself. What kind of activities take place with that, what's involved in terms of equipment. Staff also don't have a lot of information around environmental impacts of that. We've never had any communication with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans on something like this. And I think I would say we're a little bit concerned about just putting it in the bylaw as a permitted use when we don't have a lot of that information. And that's not to say that that couldn't be a very positive thing or a very economically beneficial use in the zoning bylaw. It's just to say that, you know, some of that information that I think would make us move forward with a level of comfort just isn't there at this time. And I think that's something, that type of information is information that could be provided in the context of a development application.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, would they actually have to submit a development application, or if they were to come forward with some additional information? Like, my understanding is that in terms of types of equipment or how that area is used, that it's regulated by, I think, either the province or the federal government. So if they were to come forward and say, here's the information, would that suffice, or do they actually have to go through a development permit process?
Well, I guess when I mean development application, I mean a rezoning application to permit that use in the zone.
Okay,
You know, another area of sort of ambiguity is, does this require a provincial water lot to be created for that use and leased to an owner?
Okay.
And there's a process for that. So we just don't have a lot of
Okay.
information around it.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Also, during public participation, there's some concern about permeable surfaces and stormwater. And I'm wondering how are we, is that dealt with elsewhere, or are we anticipating further guidance or on that, either in the zoning bylaw or in other documents?
Is this in relation to a specific zone or just in general?
I think just in general, there seemed to be tonight, and then I think we had some letters as well, just talking about concern of use of impermeable and permeable surfaces. So is that something that would be covered in the zoning bylaw, or is that something covered somewhere else?
It's possible that it could be covered in the zoning bylaw. It's also something that's commonly dealt with through development permit area design
Okay.
guidelines. In this case, I think we're comfortable, staff is comfortable with the level that it's dealt with in the zoning bylaw, and there are design guidelines as well that deal with that issue.
Okay. And
Mr.
then-
Newcomb, Councillor Keefe,
sorry.
if I could turn to Ms. Verhagen, please.
Thank you. Through the mayor, there is also subdivision and development bylaw 1390 for Sydney that governs subdivision and development and requires on-site stormwater management when there's increased impermeability. Now that pertains more to the
Okay.
larger developments, which, as Mr. Newcomb indicated, also have design guidelines for landscaping and
Okay.
permeability. So there are a few different things that control permeability on properties.
Okay, great, thank you for that. And just one more. So just because my neighbor asked me this today, and I'm not, I thought I knew the answer, but, so they were asking me again about garden suites, because there was no definition of what that is. And my recollection, I think, from previous discussion on this is that the reason that there wasn't a specific definition for a garden suite is because we just consider that a dwelling unit. And under the new legislation, you know, people can put up to 4 dwelling units. So is it possible then that my neighbor could put up a 3-story dwelling unit as a cottage suite?
Yes.
Okay.
The third story would need to be 70% of the gross floor area of the
Okay.
second story. So there'd be some setbacks at that third story level, but generally, yes.
Right, okay, good. Thank you, that's all for me.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. Councillor Renewal. So you're a small screen at the moment, but I see your hand now. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, and I know you mentioned by process the questions that were posed during public participation you would have addressed, so I appreciate that. With respect to Mr. Newcomb's report, there's a reference on page 5 of the report to a suggestion that the zoning bylaw be given a legal review. Mr. Newcomb notes that this is underway. Could he please provide an update with respect to either the timeline for that process or if it's complete, if there was any significant feedback that should be shared with council? Thank you.
Yeah, so the legal review is underway, and we anticipate that any adjustments that would need to be made out of that would come forward in advance of the June 10th meeting.
So thank you. So so what I hear there is that the timeline will provide staff an opportunity to address that prior to this coming back to council.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Renewal. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you to staff, Mr. Newcomb, and I apologize for not having asked this question in advance, but it just sort of popped in my mind. With regard to there's on page 3 of the report, with regard to parking in the SS small-scale multi-unit housing, forget about that. We have to say what they are so people know. It says in most cases the required 4 parking spaces are able to fit based on the modeling that you had. I wonder, are there guidelines from the province or is an approach staff would take if there are cases where there wouldn't be enough room to provide 1 space per unit?
Through the mayor to Councillor Garnett, I think on some of the smaller R1 lots, things are going to get pretty tight, especially on those in the Orchard neighborhood. There's the 25-foot wide narrower lots. It would be certainly difficult to fit parking spaces under the building in that context. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gurnett. Not seeing other speakers. While there were some comments made during the public participation, I might hold any comments I have about the comments until the motion is on the floor, but there were specific questions, and I would like to turn to some of those now to staff. And the first from Mr. Holmes was with regards to the housing target orders. We do know that Sydney was added as one of the 20 additional municipalities that will be receiving a housing target order. Could Mr. Newcomb or Mr. Humble speak briefly to the process? I could comment, but
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is a confidential process right now, so there's really not too much we can report out on. We're having discussions right now with the province, and once those discussions are concluded, then the province would report out on what the housing target order would actually be. So at this point in time, they're confidential discussions.
yeah, no.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that quick update. The second was with regards to transit-oriented areas, and I do know in the legislation it indicated specific traffic or transit intensity, if that is the correct word, or frequency. Could staff, any staff members, speak to that and what its applicability to Sydney is?
Sure, there's actually two transit components to the recent legislation. The one is the small-scale multi-unit housing component, where instead of the 4 lots that Sydney is dealing with, up to 6 lots is permitted on transit routes that provide 15-minute or greater service on average throughout the day, transit service. Sydney doesn't have any of those routes in town, so that particular part of that legislation doesn't apply to Sydney. The other transit component is the transit-oriented areas prescribed, legislated areas, I guess, where, and the key word here being prescribed, where the province has identified certain transit exchanges throughout the Victoria region and Vancouver and elsewhere, where a minimum level of density and height stories is required to be adopted into zoning bylaws. The key word there being prescribed. So Sydney does not have any of those identified areas within it. So neither of those transit-related components apply to Sydney.
Thank you. Thank you for the update. I'll leave the ones with regard to dwelling units in marine industrial to discussion. Jordan Milne raised, I guess it was a question or a request with regards to amending the zoning bylaw. He referenced section 5.1.7 in terms of the definition of determining what a story is. Appreciating that this has just come to our attention this evening at this meeting, can staff comment at this time whether an amendment under that regulation or others would in effect permit 3-story townhouses in the CD 45 zone that Mr. Jordan is referencing?
Sure, I can speak
Ms.
to
Verhagen?
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, through the mayor. So as was indicated, the OCP designation of neighborhood residential, which the west half of 9522 Lochside, really west 2/3 of it, is designated in the OCP, has a height limit of 2.5 stories. And that was put into the OCP as part of council's discussions on that new designation that was created in the OCP adopted in 2022. So that height limit of 2.5 stories in the OCP prevents us from amending the CD 45 zone to allow 3-story townhouses on that lot or on any other lots that are designated neighborhood townhouse, regardless of what the province is recommending for heights in the adjacent residential neighborhood, where they're recommending 3 stories. So amending the definition of a half story in the zoning bylaw, currently the zoning bylaw allows that half story in the lowest level in the basement. So it says it's when the ceiling height is more than 0.6 meters but less than 1.2 meters above grade. So amending the definition to allow that to be on the top of the building effectively makes it a third story by Sydney's current zoning bylaw definition. So it seems kind of a circumventing way to amending the OCP, which would result in a building that would appear to be 3 stories by our current zoning bylaw definitions. So we have previously advised that property owner that in order to make this happen on their property, in order to request it to happen, they would need to go through an OCP amendment and a zoning amendment application process. Because unfortunately, as I said, that's not an amendment that we can work into this zoning bylaw review project, because it would be in contradiction of the OCP.
Thank you. But we certainly appreciate you being able to speak to that this evening, and that you have spoken previously to the person in a process for them to move forward. Those are the items that I wanted to pull out as questions at this time. Seeing no other questions from colleagues, we do have a staff recommendation, and we can certainly have deliberation on any aspects of the zoning bylaw once we have this recommendation on the floor. I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
I'll move the recommendation, the changes to draft zoning bylaw.
Microphone, please, Councillor Novak.
I'll move that the recommendation that the changes to draft zoning bylaw number 2275 outlined in the staff report dated May 27th, 2024, and in draft version 2 of zoning bylaw number 2275 dated May 21st, 2024, be accepted by council, and that staff be directed to prepare the bylaw to be brought forward for first and second readings.
Moved by Councillor Novak, and we have it seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the mover and seconder first.
I have nothing really to say. It's all been said, but I support the bylaw as it's been presented with the amendments. I think staff have done a great job in a very limited amount of time, and I'm happy to see it go forward.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor, and I agree with my colleague, but I'd like to propose 2 amendments to this draft zoning bylaw addition. And the first would be that RM5 and CD45 be increased to 3 stories to make it consistent with the balance of other zones in the bylaw. Thank you.
Sorry, could you just repeat that slowly, please?
That RM5 and CD45 be increased from what is currently a maximum height of 2.5 stories to 3 stories.
Okay, before going to a seconder for the motion, I'm going to turn to staff, because we have heard from staff with regards to us making an amendment to the zoning bylaw that is not consistent with the OCP. So if staff could speak to that, Mr. Humble.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Mr. Mayor. So again, as staff have indicated, it wouldn't be consistent with the OCP. So if council wanted to consider such an amendment, they would first have to consider an amendment to the OCP. So that would happen prior to any potential future zoning amendments. So we're talking about process here, and so essentially it would be prohibited.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Humble. I'm going to follow up with a question. That is, the motion references RM5, which is an amended zone in the zoning bylaw, and CD45, which was actually created through a zoning variance application. So if, as we understand it from staff speaking earlier and you're speaking now, it would be inappropriate to do that for CD45 because of the process that has transpired there. Would it be appropriate, if CD45 was not included in this motion, would it be appropriate for RM5?
I'll let staff speak to that. Thank you.
Ms. Verheeg?
Thank you. That's the same situation. The OCP limits the height to 2.5 stories, so we would not be able to do that without first amending the OCP.
Okay,
and there is a process to that.
There is a process, which does include council member bringing forward a notice of motion to amend the OCP or a member of the public. Okay. Councillor Duck, you did have the floor. I'll consider the motion not in order due to process of amending the OCP. And, well, yeah, and no.
I'm still presenting the motion for discussion. So I'm seeking a seconder.
But I'm sorry, I'm not seeking a seconder because I'm ruling that the motion is
Okay.
not in order.
Can I get further clarification why this process can't go forward despite, because we have done other things that are outside the purview of the OCP that have moved forward, so I'm wondering why we can't continue the discussion on this and have that put into the bylaw, knowing that we're going to review the OCP shortly after we do the completion of the zoning bylaw.
No, thank you for the question, Councillor. I'll turn to Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So essentially, the OCP would have to come first. It can't follow the zoning. The zoning must be compliant first with the OCP. The OCP is the key document here, and so that amendment would be required first prior to making a suggested amendment to the zoning bylaw.
So, as I think we understand it, that if a member of the public or a property owner wished to come forward for a zoning amendment, if it was an amendment to the OCP, they would first have to seek an amendment to the OCP before council could consider the zoning amendment.
That's correct.
Yeah. Councillor Duck, so that is the basis of my decision.
I will withdraw the motion for this moment.
Thank you. Oh, please, Councillor Duck.
Second amendment, I would like to amend zoning group marine zones W3 to include the cultivation of seaweed. So that would be to provide recreation uses of intertidal areas and ocean and the navigation of commercial and recreation vessels to the extent the uses are of nature that will not affect the tranquility of the area, and including in this would be the cultivation of seaweed.
Okay, so as I understood the discussion earlier this evening, there was a request for council to consider adding seaweed cultivation and restoration as a permitted use in the zone. Is that in essence what you're doing?
Correct, thank you.
Okay, so that is the motion. We have a mover, do we have a seconder?
I'll second that.
Seconded. Councillor, I will turn to the mover for motivation, but I will be turning back to staff based on their earlier information that they provided to council. Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor. I think it's, as was the speaker presented in public participation, this is now becoming a significant economic driver for communities throughout the BC coast and in fact around the world. And I think given the commercial and environmental contribution seaweed cultivation has, I think it should be included here for consideration as a potential opportunity for this community. We have a seaweed farm in the region off of James Island, operated by the Sartlip, and I think it would be beneficial for this community to give consideration for this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor, I'll turn to the seconder before going to staff.
Thank you. There are several communities throughout the province that are doing this now. What I understand is that a lot of it is regulated by provincial and federal authorities anyway, so people can't just kind of go off our shores, off to Lista Park there, and throw a bunch of seaweed seed down. And all that we're doing right now is providing for the use. And so my understanding is that we're allowing that use to take place, and then the next step from that would be for their whatever guidelines staff thought that there would need to be after consulting with federal and provincial authorities. So all we're doing is allowing for the use. So I'm in favor of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now turn to staff with a question, and certainly staff can speak to it as they feel proper. But if this motion were to carry, it would still require that there would be an applicant, whether it was a resident, whether it was a business owner, to bring forward an application, and it would have to work through a process, as we've heard, through the provincial and federal government, and any considerations that staff might recommend for the application. So a permitted use doesn't mean it's going to happen. It means that we would accept applications. And my second related question to that is, if we did not approve this amendment, then if somebody did wish to pursue seaweed cultivation in a water lot, and it moved through the process, and it came forward to council to give consideration, we would then have to amend the zoning bylaw to permit that use. I'll turn to Mr. Newcomb.
I think I will go back to my earlier comment that staff simply do not have sufficient information on what this activity entails to provide a fulsome comment on this. For example, given that we anticipate there's a high level of senior government involvement, given that it involves waterways, all the permitting processes might be through the provincial or federal government. If that is the case, the rezoning process to add that permitted use might be the only touch point for the town of Sydney to be able to have a say in that process. If it's in there as a permitted use, we may not have any sort of ability to say, actually, no, this is not something that we want in that particular location. We don't know what this looks like visually. Will this involve flotation structures off the shoreline of Sydney? Will it involve boat traffic? Will it involve other visual things that might cause the residents of Sydney to become upset? We don't know that, and we don't have a good idea about the process. We don't have a good idea about the permitting. So, our perspective at this time is that it's better to go through this as a rezoning application, get that information as part of that process, and allow council to make a more fulsome decision on it.
Thank you, Mr. Newcomb. We've had the mover and seconder motivate. Would others like to speak? Councillor Duncan.
I'll just speak briefly to say I'm voting against this motion for essentially the reasons Mr. Newcomb has said. If we add something as a permitted use, but our town doesn't actually know what our end of the permitting would be, I fear that puts us in a position of, as Mr. Newcomb stated, potentially having some liability, right? That we're opening ourselves up to say, well, we allowed something, but we actually don't know what the town would be having to do as part of the allowance of it. We don't know whether that's even suitable for seaweed cultivation there. So to say that it's permitted is also giving businesses somewhat of a level of assurance that they could have a business there that we actually don't even know if they could have, because nobody's actually ever evaluated whether that specific piece of land was suitable. We've never had a business ask. For example, we've had places where, say, dog grooming became a big, having a dog grooming business was a contentious issue, and whether that was suitable for a dog groomer. But we already have those businesses, and we know roughly what they need in terms of parking spaces and square footage and sinks and hookups like that. Whereas we don't know what this would be, and I think, this is very much putting the cart before the horse. We know that seaweed companies are coming in. They may, in some future time, perhaps that can look at that area and think that it's suitable. They know the business. It's still very new. Our town does not, and putting the onus on our staff, who have already expressed they have no idea what that would entail, to be responsible for making that available is the wrong way around. I think this is a point of, if these companies are really chomping at the bit so bad to get into those particular spaces, then by all means bring this forward and help the staff come up with what they need. And I'm sure we would be amenable to perhaps a zoning bylaw change. We've changed it for other businesses. We've changed it for residential buildings, but I don't see why we would pre-zone for a type of business that we don't even understand. That seems very risky from my perspective.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Renewal.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I'll concur with Councillor Duncan. I think in part, my lack of understanding, as staff noted as well, in terms of what potential implications there may be. Leaving this as is will provide a process to be able to revisit it with some more comprehensive information. W3 is a huge open swath of water, and I'm sure there's room in there to accommodate this in some manner, but I'd like to see it retained as is to provide that process, in part because this particular zone also makes reference to uses to ensuring uses are of a nature that will not affect the tranquility of the area. And I don't know, in terms of this type of farming, how active it is and what the implications may be on navigation, etc. So I like that there's a process in here. I like that there's an appetite for local business to pursue this, and I would highly encourage them to do that. I think we'll all learn a lot in this process that would need to unfold to change the zone. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Renewal. I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. While I agree with this in principle, I tend to also support Councillor Duncan's comments that we don't know enough about it. I'm looking at the existing uses for these water lots right now, and it would appear to me that processing seaweed is a very different type of animal. It involves taking seaweed out of the water, putting it into the water, processing it in some way, packaging it in some way, treating it in some way, and none of those uses are consistent with the uses that are currently in that marine usage area. It's something that, to my mind, would be more along an industrial line. And I think it makes sense because at this point, the water lots that we have tend to be in areas where there's marine industries, there's boats, et cetera, I'm not even sure that would be feasible there. And I would prefer to leave it to a tenant or a lot owner to make the application to us on a if, as, and when needed basis to allow for that use. Having done the preliminary work with the federal and provincial governments to see if it's even possible within those water lots. So I think, as Councillor Duncan said, we're putting the cart before the horse here. We don't know what we're getting into. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. I'll turn to any other first-time speakers. Councillor Gannett, myself. I won't support the motion. I support the idea, and thank you for bringing the idea forward this evening for consideration. I don't believe Council is showing opposition to the idea. I think it's we're speaking to process, and that the process to have seaweed cultivation and restoration in water lots is not cumbersome. There's going to be a detailed process that involves the provincial and federal government and will involve the municipal government. And I note Mr. Newcomb's point that if it is already a permitted use and we're not otherwise involved, then the town really won't have any opportunity to comment. So similar to other speakers, I would encourage any interested applicants to come forward, because it sounds like it's been positive for the environment and for the economy elsewhere, and could be beneficial to Sydney as well. Seeing no further speakers, I'll call the question on the amendment. All in favor? Opposed? Councillor Duncan, Councillor Gurnett, myself, Councillor O'Keefe, and Councillor O'Toole. The motion is defeated. Councillor Duck, you indicated you had two, and we've proceeded through those. Are there other? Councillor Gurnett?
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to move to amend maximum residential density in the W1-U to 1 dwelling unit per lot.
Second.
We have a mover and a seconder. Councillor Gurnett?
Yeah, I as it's been spoken to previously at the public participation period, and I had been giving this a lot of thought since we last met, and I think a lot of Sydney residents don't realize the importance and significance of the economic benefit to our community of the Harbour Road and the industrial or marine use in that area and what it brings to our community. And I think much like the industrial area, it's an area you want to protect, and it's an area you want to cultivate and you don't want to lose. So I think given that context, I think it's really important that we focus our zoning bylaw on the actual marine uses as much as possible, and to limit the actual dwelling units that are there, I think would help enhance that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Gannett. I'll turn to the seconder.
Oh, thank you. I had been kind of two minds on this because I thought on the one hand, having 2 units could be like the owner and an employee, because I know for a lot of the industrial areas, getting employees' residences is important, and maybe that would help them. But in the end, I think I probably support this amendment simply because there's no guarantee that it would be, an owner-operator building a building and putting in these residences and restricting it to employees, and it could end up being somebody else who's not associated with that zone, and that has been causing, conflicts in the expectations for what goes on there. So overall, this is probably the best bet for kind of minimizing conflict with supporting industry in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. I'll turn to Councillor Keefe.
Thank you for Councillor Garnett for this. I will support the motion. We heard during the OCP process, we heard through the development of our economic development strategy from that industry to please protect us. So we need to do that. Also, one of the things we want to do in our ECDEV strategy is to build our blue economy. And so we need as much space as we can to help that industry grow. In terms of housing, housing is a need, but you know what? Now with the new legislation, there's more opportunity, 4 units per lot in the surrounding residential area. So there's no need for us to be, I would have been fine with 0 housing down there, but the staff in a previous email today made a reasonable case in terms of owner-operator situation. So I'm happy with that. I happy to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. Seeing no further speakers, I'll call a question on the amendment. All in favor? That carries unanimous. Thank you. Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Sticking with the marine sector, I will move that the following uses be removed as being permitted or conditional uses in zones W1 and W1-U. Artist studio, brew pub, recreation rental, and personal services.
Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the mover and the seconder. Sorry, I'm just going to turn to Ms. Nelson. Did you capture? Thank you. Councillor Keefe?
Yeah, so as just outlined with the previous motion, the importance of trying to maintain as much space as we can, specifically for marine-related uses. Artist studio, it's a nice scenic spot to have an artist studio, but it doesn't need to be taking up space for our marine sector. Brew pub and pub, one could argue it'd be nice to have that for the workers down there, but we are such a small community. Zip on Rest Haven and you're downtown within less than 5 minutes to go for a beer after work or whatever, so I don't think that's required. Recreational rental, this is not a tourist area, this is a working harbor. So recreational rentals, kayak rentals, bike rentals, that sort of thing, that should be downtown. There is already provision for rental of boats in that area, which is fine. And then finally, personal services. Again, those are things that space that could be used by marine-related businesses or offices. So I just think it's important to take out anything that isn't marine-related to be able to support that industry and allow it to grow the way that we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to Councillor Duck. And
Nothing
then I have
to
a
add.
question through staff. Sir? Thank you, Councillor Duck. My question through to staff is with regards to the recreational use. I've heard a couple of comments about that. Could staff describe the intention of the recreational use as it was added to in that zone?
Describe the intention?
So recreational use, there's recreational boating uses. We've heard of kayak as one, but there are other boating recreational uses. And
Right, so
if removal of this, does that impact that? There is a marina there, there's wharves there.
Yeah, recreation rental is more small scale rental of paddle boards, kayaks, bicycles, things like that, that someone might rent for a few hours. I believe boat rental and chartering is a different use, so that use wouldn't be affected.
Thank you for the clarification. Councillor Keith?
Yeah, it's just going to point out that marine rental or charter rentals are still permitted use in that area.
Thank you. Seeing no further, Councillor Duncan?
I would actually, the recreational rental, the inclusion of bike rental in there is actually pertinent too. I know that the marina currently does provide bicycles, like in an area for their yacht owners or people who come into the marina. So I feel, and they're fairly well used because a lot of, people aren't coming into the town with cars when they're on their boats. Bike rental might be a use you want to have because some of those existing businesses might want to add that to their service lines for their existing customers. I mean, I don't know, technically if they're doing it as not a formal rental because it's being provided free of charge because it's currently a yacht thing. But on the other hand, providing bicycles is very expensive because people do tend to trash them and extracting some payback from that might become required. So I'm loath to remove that simply because I'm worried about how it might impact current businesses when they're providing their service lines.
Okay. I have a question through to staff, and that is, if we were to remove recreational rental, and that was to carry along with the other parts of the amendment, and then to add bicycle rental to be more specific, would staff have any comment? It's putting you on the spot, and I'm sorry for that.
I mean, I would say that staff are happy to report back on some of these uses at the next council meeting and provide a more fulsome discussion around them and, what's involved in some of the potential implications of removing them from these zones.
So having heard that, when we're bringing them, when the bylaw comes forward for first, second, and third reading on June 10th, at second reading, council would be able to make an amendment such as this? I'm not sure that was anticipated, but I'm posing the question in terms of staff responding that they could bring back further information on the uses.
I guess I was thinking that the bylaw could sort of have readings as amended with those specific uses either being included or not included in the as amended reading.
So, so while it would be brought forward for readings at the next meeting, before proceeding with readings, council could amend.
Those determinations would be made and then proceed to provide readings based on council's decision on those items.
Okay, and they would have to be fairly well understood amendments because we're then proceeding immediately into readings.
Yeah, the idea, I guess, would be to provide very specific recommendations that could form the basis for those resolutions and provide that level of clarity.
Okay.
I mean, I'm just, I guess, it's difficult to see the implications of these types of changes in a meeting like this, and so further time to consider it is always helpful.
Yeah, so I will turn to Ms. Verhagen, then Mr. Humble.
Thank you. Just a thought on amending recreational rental and coming up with a new permitted use of bicycle rental. That does have implications for other zones where recreational rental is permitted. So there's a number of kind of follow-on impacts that this change would then make to other zones, which is really difficult to make on the fly during a meeting. So just a caveat about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And it was the reason for my question. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Humble.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn to Mr. Humble, and then I will come back to Council and Councillor Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, these are fairly substantive amendments that are being proposed, and I would agree that if Council is so inclined, staff could bring back a very brief report that could precede the bylaw item coming forward, and would have an opportunity. So if there's these particular items can be referred to staff to consider and report back prior to consideration of the bylaws, then or the bylaw, then that would be helpful. And if there's any others as well, because they are fairly significant.
No, thank you, Mr. Humble. So my suggestion to council is that we have a main motion on the floor. We've amended it. is that if we withdraw this amendment, then we conclude any other amendments in the main motion, then a motion arising could be to request staff to bring, to report back on a proposed amendment, or such as the uses in this, in these water zones. So if the mover and seconder would consider withdrawal at this time, as I indicated, it could come back as a motion arising.
Sure.
And there's still an opportunity for us to amend before proceeding with readings on the June 10th meeting. I have nods from the mover and seconder, so that is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments from council? Councillor Renewal, you did have your hand up.
No, thank you. It's been withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you. It's 8:25. I will call a 5-minute recess to 8:30. Thank you. Okay, I'll reconvene our meeting now. And for those just joining the meeting, no, I'm So we do have a main motion on the floor. It has been amended more than once, I believe. And so it is an amended motion, but I will turn to members of council if there are any other amendments that council wishes to put forward. And then we could have any discussion or deliberation as general comments before voting. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. So, turning to Galaran next, there's a couple things I want to propose. I'm not sure if I should do it in two separate motions or one. Maybe I'll do it all at once.
Well,
and then if,
read your motion, and when, if needed, we'll take guidance from staff on whether it should be separated.
okay. So, what I would like to propose is that the RM7 zoning for the properties between Beacon West and John Place be maintained, but that the remaining residential area be zoned as R2 as per the recent provincial legislation, and that staff include a review of the West Side Local Area Plan during the OCP process that will take place in 2025.
Okay, so I think I heard two parts to your motion. The first part was to allow RM7W. We don't need a motion to allow RM7W.
Okay.
So there is RM7W, and then there is.
Sorry, I meant RM7WS. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, whatever the zone is properly referenced as, we don't need a motion to allow it.
Okay,
You need to speak to the remaining parts of
Right.
the remaining zones. There are other zones you're speaking to other than that.
Yes, and so I guess the best,
So the zones that
there's
the zones that you want to change
So
should
it-
be the only ones referenced in the motion.
okay, so that the M2 zones be changed to R2, and that the RM7WS zones that are at the, that are adjacent to the highway and at the end of the cul-de-sacs also be zoned to R2.
Okay, so I'm gonna take them, I'm gonna suggest that we split the motion and that you proceed with either one of the two. I mean, we're talking about
Okay.
two different zones in the zoning bylaw.
Okay,
There may be differing opinions
Okay.
or information with regards to those two zones.
okay,
I realize the outcome is the same in terms of the request to go to R2, but whether you want to start with RM7WS
Sure.
or whether you want to start with M2.
okay, thank you for that. Okay, so I'll start with the RM7WS. So this is the, as I said, the.
Sorry, just read the motion and then we'll get a
Okay.
seconder and then we'll have motivation.
So that the RM7 zones that are located in the Galaran neighborhood.
Sorry, we know where the zones are, so we don't have to specify in the Galeran.
Okay.
Are these zones elsewhere in the?
Well, yeah,
community?
because there's different parts, so there's different areas of RM7 within the Galaran zone.
It's
So that's why-
RM7, can you please, sorry, point of
order?
clarification, point of order, RM7WS. You keep saying
RM
RM7 and
yeah,
that's
sorry.
confusing things.
Yes, I'm
Thank you.
sorry. RM7WS. So on the zoning map for Galaran, there's RM7WS that is along Beacon. And that's why I was saying I'm sticking, I'm fine with that. What I'm seeking to remove is the RM7WS that is adjacent to the highway and at the end of the cul-de-sacs in the Galaran neighborhood.
Thank you for the clarification, so please proceed with as you were.
Okay, so in regards to the RM7WS,
We're not motivating, you're putting a motion on the floor.
okay, sorry,
So you're proposing that RM7WS alongside the highway, the portion of RM7WS along the highway be changed to R2.
yes.
Does that capture?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second for discussion.
We have it seconded, but I'm gonna turn to staff. Mr. Humble?
So thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just for clarification, are we talking about just those adjacency properties to the highway? Because there are a number of properties that are not fronting on Beacon Avenue West that don't fit that criteria. So I think it's important we get clarity here in terms of the specific properties that are being referenced.
Would it be?
So, I'm,
Sorry, if I can
oh, sure,
attempt, try to help?
sure.
So if it would be RM7-WS, west of the, no, that won't work west of the highway because it includes Beacon Avenue West.
Or can we just say as
I'm-
shown in the
I'm
the
gonna
map?
hold, I'm gonna hold for a moment.
Okay.
Mr. Newcomb, could you assist? So would RM7WS not on Beacon, not including on Beacon Avenue West? Cover it? I'll turn back to Mr. Newcomb.
The area north of John Place?
Councillor Keefe,
Up to the north side of Airedale.
Yeah, I don't know what those streets.
I
what
think
the
this is
names of
Airedale.
those-
John
the
Place
streets are.
is the one closest to
Yeah,
Beacon
so
Avenue West.
the intent was, as the mayor said, that the R2 would be those RM7WS zone properties currently, except for those fronting onto Beacon West and John Place. That's why I included,
Okay,
mentioned that in
so
the
there are
first
two, I
motion.
am seeing two properties off the cul-de-sac north of John Place. So are those included or not? Because you've said off John Place.
I'm saying all of the,
Properties south of John,
yes.
but there are two on John
Oh, I
Place
see.
north of
I see what you mean.
John Place.
So excluding those two properties then.
So your motion, as read, that is off Beacon Avenue and John Place, does cover
Yes.
all the properties off Beacon Avenue West and John Place on both sides of John Place.
We're excluding the properties on the south side of John Place,
But not the north side.
not the north side.
Okay.
So, yeah, so that whole light,
The RM7WS properties off Beacon Avenue and John Place South.
yeah, I think that covers it.
Okay,
So that those would be, converted to,
R2.
zoned as R2.
Okay, so we did have a mover and we had a seconder as well.
Clarify that again, just that RM7-WS zone properties.
On Beacon Avenue West and John Place South. South of John Place.
Excluding
Mhm.
excluding the RM7WS that is on Beacon West and Jan Road South.
John Place.
Jean Place, sorry.
Okay, so I think we have an understanding of what we're speaking to now. We have a mover and seconder. I would go forward with motivation. Councillor O'Keefe.
Okay, thank you. So there's a number of issues at play here, complicated by the new legislation that the provincial government has come forward with. So if the provincial government had not come forward with this legislation, all that area zoned as M2 would have been M3. That was kind of what we
Okay,
were.
so we're not referring to M2 now, are we?
Well, I'm trying to provide.
Go ahead.
Okay. And so the reason, when we originally completed this OCP, the reason that we put those high density residential units at the end of the cul-de-sac was because we wanted, one of the policies in the OCP was to minimize the impact on the existing residential neighborhood. And so if we had gone forward with the plan to zone that area for M3, the concern at the time was that if we had residential, we felt that the residential units were best situated there because then they wouldn't have to worry about business traffic going past and that sort of thing. However, the situation is now that with that zone being M2, my concern is that we're not going to see the development that we're expecting. It doesn't comply with our current OCP. Those residential units will probably continue to be there for a long time.
Okay,
And so
I am going to interject for just a moment because it may be lost, but you indicated or stated that M2 is not consistent with the OCP. Can staff speak to that, please?
I mean, staff wouldn't have brought forward the M2 zone if we didn't feel it wasn't consistent. Got a double negative there, but staff feel it's consistent with the OCP.
So I'll clarify that it doesn't, the idea was that perhaps developers would apply for that M3 zoning to increase that additional density. But the way that it's written as an M2, we wouldn't get that additional density because that's the way it's written. And I understand staff's logic for that in terms of we were wanting to mitigate the impacts on the neighborhood. But having said that, if we leave those RM7WS zones in place, that would allow a developer to come in now and put up multi-story buildings at the end of those cul-de-sacs. And that was one of the things that we were wanting to mitigate in terms of impact to the neighborhood. And so that's why I'm suggesting that we pull those out. Now, in terms of, I know there's concern about, one of the reasons that we wanted that extra density was for workforce housing. I think we're going to see that along Beacon and John Place, the new development, 140 units there. And if we go ahead with the next motion, which would be to convert that M2 to R2, that allows for the additional density of 4 units per lot, and the additional density that's going to be permitted in the rest of Sydney. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe. I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor Duck.
Thank you, Mayor. I support this motion because I indicated in past that I oppose any high-density multifamily residential in close proximity to the highway. We already have CD 43 that's going to fulfill that, and I remain concerned that we're putting that much housing close to the highway for just livability purposes. I do favor that we start to look at this area much like we have on the east side of the highway for light industrial. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Mayor. If I may, through you to staff. So this change would obviously not comply with the OCP. Would that be correct?
Through the mayor to Councillor Garnett, I would say it's certainly not consistent with the direction of the OCP and the West Side Local Area Plan that's part of the OCP.
And it definitely flies in opposition to the land use map, which is clearly delineates it as multi-unit residential. And while I agree with Councillor O'Keefe in terms of how we wanted to minimize the impact, we also all agreed at the time outside in on multi-unit residential, and this is outside in. And I am somewhat perplexed because the OCP passed with that land use in there. I didn't vote for it, but it passed, respecting council's decision. So it's difficult for me now to see staff bring zoning that correlates to what's in the OCP and the Westlap and the land use map. And now it's a problem, when for me this discussion should have taken place when the OCP, before the OCP was adopted, and it didn't. So I won't support the motion because staff has presented what reflects the OCP. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. We'll go to first-time speakers. Councillor O'Keefe. Yep. Are there other first-time speakers? So I will speak to it briefly. That I have concerns with accepting this or supporting this motion for similar reasons to what Councillor Garnett has stated. We've gone through a process which included public engagement that spoke to multi-unit in this location. Part of the rationale for the motion on the floor could be, but I didn't hear it, was that given Bill 44, the intention of bringing increased residential density would occur with Bill 44, RM2 Bill 44. That is not going to be the same density as the RM7WS. So I appreciate that there may be some rationale for doing it, but I think if we were to consider changing the zones other than what is in the draft zoning bylaw, there should be additional public engagement. And there is not the opportunity to do this at this time through the process that we're in now. So I'm going to leave my comments there and turn to other speakers. If I don't see any other first-time speakers, I will go to second-time speakers. I'll go to Councillor Duncan as a first-time speaker.
Yeah, thank you. I'm still, there's a strange fixation on this neighborhood that I'm not quite understanding compared to, say, the other side of the highway, which was brought up, and I think Councillor Duck maybe misspoke about saying concentrating on the east side of the highway as becoming industrial. I think you meant further up on the west side. No? Because there's no industrial zone on this side of on the east side of the highway. And in fact, it's RM7, which I can't see much of a substantial difference between RM7WS, because it's west side, and RM7, which is again right up against the highway, There is, the R2 and R1. So it's kind of this thing about, for some reason, if we had 4 houses there, if it went up to the provincial, those people wouldn't be suffering from highway noise, but if they put in, additional townhouses or a, 4-story apartment building, those people, I suppose, could, because they're higher up, but it's like a strange fixation with this particular stretch of the highway being noisier than other stretches of the highway, where we currently have, similar densities of residential being planned, and I'm not really sure why. And I share Councillor Garnett's this is a large change that isn't following the OCP and the West Side Local Area Plan. And I know people keep trying to bring this back because they weren't happy with the way it ended, so they keep thinking they can do an end run around the process. But I think this is one of those things where there's a process, it gets approved to try and then sneak an end run around to change it back to something what they would have preferred previously, I think is probably disingenuous to the process. I know the federal government likes to do that kind of thing all the time when they get a new council in, but I don't really approve of that kind of approach to it, so I won't support it as it stands.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Not seeing other first-time speakers, I will turn to Councillor O'Keefe, then Councillor Duck as second-time speakers.
Thank you. So just some,
speaking to the motion.
yes, and to clarify some of the comments that have been made. So is it in line with the OCP? No, but neither are all of the other changes that we're making to the residential neighborhood. So in my residential neighborhood, it's currently not in the OCP that we would allow 4 dwelling units. That's not in the OCP, but we're doing it because we're required.
Point of order.
Yes.
I don't think we should be debating.
Sorry, your point of order through the chair?
Through the chair. I don't think we should be debating Bill 44 in context of what we're talking about.
Well, no, it's definite. It's related.
I'm making comment on the point of order.
Sure.
Sorry, your point of order again, Councillor?
I don't think we should be making comments related to this discussion on this particular item with regards to Bill 44.
Thank you, Councillor Garnett. I've noted your point of order. I think the reference to Bill 44 in terms of the R1, R2 not being in the OCP, and drawing an analogy to this amendment not being in the OCP is a reasonable argument. So, Councillor Keefe, having made that point, if you could continue.
Yes, because the reason Bill 44 is relevant is because this whole area that was previously R1, I believe, would have been subject to the 4 units. So although it's not in the OCP, we would normally be required to do that. And to get to the previous point about the additional density, that's the whole point, that there will be, if we go to the R2, which is what the provincial government has asked us to do with those residential neighborhoods, we would get that additional density. The other point I wanted to make is that I'm concerned that with the M2 zone is not exactly what we said we were going to do.
Point of order, we're speaking about the RM7WS.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but it's related.
Councillor O'Keefe.
Okay.
When the point of order is made, I will comment on the point of order. Your point of order, Councillor Duncan?
I'm worried that once again we're going to be mixing up the zones. The RM, I mixed it up earlier, as Councillor Garnett just pointed to me, that I said the RM7 was on the east side of the highway, where it's RM6, but it's the point that it could also build an apartment. But right now we're talking about the RM7WS, where you can build up to an apartment building.
Okay, sorry, you've made the point that Councillor O'Keefe is speaking about the RM2 when the motion on the floor is with regards to RM7.
Yes, so Bill 44.
I'm going to take that point of order. Thank you, Councillor Duncan. And Councillor O'Keefe, if you could speak to RM7, please.
So
and R2.
So it's the same point, is that RM7WS was zoned residential, and so under Bill 44, we would have been required to zone it to R2 anyways. So if there's concerns about the OCP and that sort of thing, and that we're not complying, the provincial government has told us that we have license to do that.
Okay.
So that's the point.
I'm going to call a point of order. I'm going to interject. The provincial government has said that single and 2-family zones have to be amended as we're amending them. While this is currently, these houses that are being spoken of are single and 2-family, we have already gone through an OCP process where the land designation has changed. So the provincial requirement under Bill 44 is not to make these compliant with Bill 44. We have the option of doing that, but I'm hearing that part of the motivation is that we should be required, or we would have been required to do that. We have an OCP land use designation that does not require, Bill 44 does not require us to go to RM2. So that's my point of clarification. I will let you continue.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I was just trying to make the point. There's concerns about, we can't do this because it's not in the OCP, but we could choose to do it. And we wouldn't need an OCP amendment if we wanted to do that. So I'll leave it at that, I think.
Okay, I'll turn to Councillor Duck, who wanted to speak for a second time, and then Councillor Duncan. And then, actually, before Councillor, if I may, Councillor Duck and Councillor Duncan go to Councillor Novick for a first time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're motivating on this amendment, and so I'm saying that I'm going to vote against this for the simple reason that I think the arguments about Bill 44 are spurious, because we have gone through an OCP process, as Mayor stated, where we agreed to make these changes here. So saying they should go back to a residential use or an R1 or R2, when we've made the decision through the OCP not to have those designations in this area, why would we consider now going against the decision of the OCP simply because the government passed Bill 44 and said, oh yeah, well, you can turn R1s into 4 units. It doesn't change the value of having created an OCP with these new designations. So for that reason, I would vote against it, because I think we're just, we're trying to change the OCP here. This amendment is really trying to change the OCP, when that's not the purpose of this this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'm now going to turn to Councillor Duck for a second time, and then Councillor Duncan for a second time.
Thank you, Mayor. Just to clarify my points, I am not suggesting that we, what the amendment is asking is the RM7WS be removed from north of John Place. It doesn't mean I'm saying remove it from the OCP. That is a proposal by staff to put RM7 on that side. Doesn't mean it can't go on the other side of that same Galaran neighborhood. And to clarify a colleague's point, currently on the east side of the highway, we do have light industrial. I will remind them that the Superior Collision, National Rental Car, Steve's Garage are all down that side. And the other part that we have on the east side that we don't have on the west side right now is noise attenuation berms or foliage that is blocking noise for those R2 and R1 locations there. That doesn't exist on the west side, and that's my concern, is that the livability of putting high rises next to the highway. Nowhere else in the CRD do we have high rises this close to the highway. Nowhere. And it's just, I just have concerns about the livability of these. It doesn't mean that we don't have RM7WS. That can be on the other side facing onto Galaran. And this area can be looked at for light industrial uses, much like on the east side and further up on the west side of the highway. So I'm not saying we change the Western Sydney, West Sydney local area plan. I'm just saying the designation of where that RM7WS goes. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question of process through to staff. Earlier this evening, we had a motion come to the floor, which was to request to amend the zoning bylaw to allow 3 stories in RM5. And after discussion, information from staff, we were told that the proper process is to amend the OCP and then to amend the zoning bylaw. Here we are, this amendment, and I'm seeking staff's input, this amendment is not consistent with the OCP. And so similarly, the appropriate process should be to amend the OCP and then amend the zone. So I'm sorry I didn't think of this earlier when I was accepting the motion onto the floor, but I would ask staff if
I'll just defer the question to maybe Allison or Corey. I'm not sure if they've got a response.
Mr. Newcomb?
Thanks for the question. So the language in Bill 44 specifically says if you have a zone that permits only single or two-family dwellings, it must be updated to allow for 4 units. And for the purposes of doing that, you can essentially ignore your OCP. So we have that situation in the Galleran neighborhood. I think that's one option that's open. But that's the only other option, apart from going with the OCP compliant zoning. And the comment that was just made about light industrial on those lots is not possible because those lots are designated in the OCP as multi-unit residential. So those lots need to be either multi-unit residential or Bill 44 compliant lots.
Okay, so I am taking it that this amendment is appropriate because we are only considering going to R2, which is a provision under Bill 44. So the motion is still on the floor, and I had Councillor Duck, then I had Councillor Duncan.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you, Councillor Duck, for the clarification of meaning that because the industrial is currently there. What I meant was it's not zoned for it. It's grandfathered in, but technically we have that this neighborhood would change to match this one. I feel, on the one hand, I don't want to take more time. On the other, I feel this is something that keeps getting discussed in the public, and we use words like high rises when it's 4 stories. If this motion amendment passed and it went to R2, we could have 3. It's 3 stories versus 4 stories, and we're thinking it's maybe not entirely compliant with the OCP. It feels like we're trying to get something and we don't know why. There's concerns about noise, but currently these are residential, and if we zoned it to R2, we could have 4 3-story dwellings on each of these places. I don't know why that would be less noise. If we're concerned about that now because it's RM7WS, we could have single family or 2-family or townhouse, which is less than 4. And so we're saying we're not concerned about the apartments, which would actually be higher density than R2, but we're concerned it could be less density, and we want to get more by bidding it up to R2. Then again, we're kind of running into this, but why are we saying we want more density by doing that, but we're not concerned about that noise, but we are concerned? It seems to be like it's just a sticking point about apartment dwellings, that you just want maybe apartment dwellings removed from the RM7WS. I don't see what the benefit is other than some sort of appearance that it's staying with the current residential use. But I don't know why we're having to do something that would be not in compliance with our OCP, bringing in some sort of rationale that has to do with Bill 44, when really the problem is we wanted 3 stories instead of 4. Is that?
Thank you for making your point, Councillor Duncan. I'm going to turn to Councillor Gurnett.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, as far as, I think it's important to also distinguish between the RM7WS and the provincial legislation R2, which it probably would be if it reverted to what's being suggested, is that 4 stories with the potential to go to 5 and 6 with affordability components, which you won't get probably to the same extent in an R2 with the legislation. And also, by my count, 18 lots, so even if they maxed out at 4 per lot, that's 72 units. If you look at what's there in terms of land use assembly potential for multi-unit residential, it's going to be considerably higher. So I don't think the provincial government's going to be concerned about whether we're going to build 72 when we can build 272 potentially. I don't know, I'm just throwing numbers out there with affordability components, which I think is the end game here anyways. So I think what the staff has proposed here makes sense in terms of a housing crisis and building housing that people can actually afford to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'm not supporting the motion on the floor for I've spoken earlier, but in essence what the motion is doing is this is proposed as a residential zone, and the amendment is proposed to change it to a different residential zone. In essence, what the motion is doing is reducing the density, is lowering the density. So what is the rationale for lowering the density? I have heard the rationale in terms of the proximity to the highway and those concerns. However, I'm not in support of it because we're reducing the density without further public engagement, not consistent with the OCP. I'll leave my comments there. We've covered this fairly well, councillors. I'm not looking to turn to councillor members for a third time. If there's anyone wishing to speak for a first time, seeing none, I'll call the question. All in support of the amendment? Opposed? We have Councillor Duncan, Councillor Gurnett, myself, Councillor Novick, and Councillor Renewal opposed. The motion is defeated. Thank you, Councillor. You did have a second motion you wanted to bring forward?
In the same vein, maybe we can get through this quicker. And it's related to the previous one, so that the M2 be changed to R2 zoning.
Okay, before seeking a seconder, we're going to request clarification from staff. Can this motion just be about M2, or do we have to include M3?
Could be just M2 at this time.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder for the motion?
Second for discussion.
Seconded by Councillor Duck. I'll turn to the mover.
Thank you. So the reason I wanted to be able to speak to those two things at the same time is it might have addressed some of the concerns about what's the motivation for this. So my concern about the M2 zoning is that it's not exactly what we asked for in the OCP. What we had originally proposed there was M3, which was the higher density. And I understand why staff came up with the M2 because it's lower impact. M2 does not provide more density. The R2 provides more density than the M2. But my understanding and talking with staff is that what we were hoping is that developers would come forward and ask for a rezoning for M3 to increase that density. So that's what I understand the plan to be. My concerns about that is that the M2 on its own, I don't feel, in talking to development community, is attractive. So that I'm concerned that under the M2 zoning, developers won't be coming forward to do M2 developments. And so we won't get any additional density from that. The hope is that developers will come forward and ask for the M3 zoning. What I'm worried is that they won't come forward because developers have come forward in the past. Some of you may recall the Skylark development that developers came forward with. And we said, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want big developments right in the middle of a lot. And so the concern is that there's probably going to be very few places where we're going to approve that M3 zoning because we don't want to be disruptive to the neighborhood. And so my concern is that as a result of that, is that we won't get the density that we want. The West Side Local Area Plan has been in place for 12 years, and developers have had, I think it's 12, or I don't know.
Sorry.
A long time. 7, sorry. Thank you. But a long time. And we've seen very few applications come forward for that. And so I can't see how this particular zoning is going to get the density that we want. And so that's why I think that we have a better chance of getting density if we kept it as R2. Then at least there's 4 units per lot that is permitted. It's something that I think would be more agreeable and fit into that neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that's not in decline. People there are improving their properties. So I don't see that M2 is going to get us the density that we want, and that's why I think R2 is a better option for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Before going to the seconder, I'm going to ask perhaps Mr. Newcomb, if you could please put up the map again and please distinguish the M2 and M3 zone, please.
So just to clarify again, that the M2 zone has been applied to those properties shown in blue here on the map in the Galleria neighborhood. The M3 zone is in the bylaw, but not yet applied to any property. So regardless of what the, yeah, it could be applied to a property through a council map amendment.
So M3 does cover the same area as M2, but it has to be applied for a rezoning.
M3 is intended to cover the same area M3 is intended to cover the same area as M2, yes, but needs to be applied through a rezoning process approved by council. And that's, as you'll recall from my earlier staff report on this topic, following from that policy in the OCP where council indicated they'd like to proceed with rezonings in this area on a case-by-case basis to try to fit those developments into the neighborhood
Thank you for the
more cautiously.
Thank you for the clarification. I'll motivate in my turn. I'll next turn to the seconder.
No comment at this time.
Thank you. I'll speak next and then turn to other speakers. Councillor Novick, is that my concern is that I mean there's some rationale here. Before we were talking about going from a higher density residential use to a lower density residential use. In terms of removing M2, what we're doing is we're removing a ground floor industrial commercial use. So we're changing the use, which is in the land designation in the OCP, to a purely residential use. Yet at the same time, we want to leave M3 there. So people can go ahead and do R2, or they can go ahead and apply under M3. So I'm not appreciating the rationale for not removing M2 and M3 at the same time, because if to not be in support of M2 but to be in support of M3 and rezoning it to R2, which is just increased residential density, the rationale I don't follow. I'll leave my comments there and turn to other speakers. Councillor Novick, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Again, I have the same argument that I did for the previous amendment, and that is the zone, the multi-purpose industrial or mixed-use zones are a result of the OCP. And staff are simply following the OCP and creating these zones. I don't think it's the purpose of council at this time to say, well, people aren't going in that direction. We're not getting development in that direction. So we should revert to a purely residential zone. I think, again, if it's council's wish to do that, then we need to go back and make an amendment to the OCP and say, we don't want the mixed-use industrial zone for the west side plan. So for those reasons, I'm not in favor of this. We would have to do away with all the M zones. As the mayor stated, what's the point of having M1, M2, and M3 and only taking away M2 because it's on the map now? I think we have to yield to the expertise of our staff who've created this in light of the OCP, in light of what months and months of consultations and discussions yielded in terms of the OCP. And if we want to change it, we've got to go back to that original process. Now is not the time to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novick. I'll turn to, there are other first-time speakers? Other speakers? Not seeing, Councillor Keefe, new points?
Just in response to the comment about this is what's in the OCP, what is described in the M2 was not consistent with where we were wanting to go. The M3 was, but the M2 wasn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keefe. Not seeing further discussion, I'll call the question. All those in support of the amendment? Opposed? Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, Councillor Garnett, myself, Councillor Novick, and Councillor O'Toole are opposed. The motion is defeated. Thank you for the discussion, Council. Councillor O'Keefe, did you have any further
Nope, that's it for me.
amendments? Okay, Council, any further amendments to the zoning bylaw? Seeing none, we do have the amended motion, main motion on the floor. Just before calling the question, I want to thank staff for the engagement process that transpired and presenting the results of that engagement. And we do see that engagement has benefits. We saw a number of changes that staff made to the bylaw, and you know, wording was improved, definitions were improved as well. So I think the process was very fruitful, very beneficial for this zoning bylaw. And just as the previous zoning bylaw was substantially amended, I believe it was in 2012, there are amendments that occur, you know, following that. And once we are working with this zoning bylaw, there may be amendments that we wish to consider in the future. And we do appreciate that for some of the more substantial motions that were proposed this evening, that a more appropriate process would be to consider an OCP amendment prior to amending the zoning bylaw. So my primary speaking was to thank staff for all of the engagement sessions and engagement work that led to this evening and the changes in the second draft. I'll leave my comments there and see no further discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We're next moving to item 13B, which is Municipal Security Issuing Resolution regarding the Parkland acquisition. And I'll turn to staff for an introduction. Would that be Mr. Hissick?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're looking to obtain a council resolution as the last required step to allow us to borrow under the Parkland acquisition loan authorization bylaw. So the estimated annual loan servicing costs are about $102,000, but for this year it'll only be $28,000 because of the timing of the loan, and both of these amounts are included in our financial plan.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Are there any questions before going to the recommendation? Seeing none, could I have someone move the recommendation? Councillor Novick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will move that Council approve borrowing from the Municipal Finance Authority of British Columbia as part of their 2024 fall borrowing session, $1,300,000 as authorized through the Parkland Acquisition Loan Authorization Bylaw number 2262, and that the Capital Regional District be requested to consent to our borrowing over a 20-year term and include the borrowing in their security issuing bylaw.
We have a mover. Do we have a seconder, please? Seconded by Councillor Duncan. Motivation? Councillor Novick? Councillor
Nothing
Duncan?
to add.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you, staff, for bringing it forward, which was a requirement. We're turning to item 13C, which is the Shaw Center Energy Supply Agreement Renewal. I'll turn to staff for an introduction, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Mayor. The Shaw Center operates in a town-owned facility that is served by a geothermal heating and cooling system. The most recent agreement governing that system is up for renewal. The cost increase is roughly in line with inflation over the past 5 years, and staff are recommending renewal as there really are no other options for heating and cooling for the facility without costly retrofits.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Are there any questions? Seeing none, I'd look for a mover. Councillor Garnett, either question or move?
I'll move. I'll move the recommendation that the energy supply agreement with Sydney Pier Geothermal Utility Corporation be renewed for an additional 5-year term.
Second.
We have it moved and seconded. I'll turn to the mover and seconder. No discussion. I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. We're now under the first item of correspondence, 14A, request for funding, the Saanich Peninsula Legion event. And we have a recommendation. There is no staff introduction for this, but given the request, sorry, I will turn to Mr. Hissick because Mr. Hissick, there was an additional piece of information after contacting the Legion with regards to whether the funding request was for the event or whether it was for fundraising.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We were informed that it's entirely for the fundraising campaign to fund their new home, and none of the money is required for the event in particular.
Okay, so just a note to council that if council did not wish to consider an amount, that we could just receive this for information, which, or if council member wants to pursue allocating a specific amount, then we would need a motion to do that and have deliberation on that. So I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Just a question.
Sure.
So my understanding is, so they're wanting to build a new Legion Hall. I presume that's going to be a long-term thing, so I wonder if this is something that we need to respond to right now, or we can refer it to next year for, when we review our the donations we give to community organizations.
Yeah, so this is not motivation, this is just trying to provide clarity, so that, in essence, if it is a donation to a capital project that they have, or a project, quite frankly, this is outside our normal budget process, and it would normally come forward through the budget process and or the grants and aid process. We do have from time to time a request for a particular event that comes up outside the budget process, and if we have a funding mechanism for that, we have in the past considered that as a one-off and support that particular event, but we've heard that this funding request is not with regards to the event, it's with regards to a project. So not motivating, but just indicating, and I'm going to turn to Councillor Renewal, who has his hand up.
I'll move receipt for information.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Moved by Councillor Renewal and seconded by Councillor Garnett. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? The motion carries unanimous. Thank you. And the second item of correspondence was raised by Councillor Duck. And Councillor Duck, you can refer to the correspondence again and then speak to it, please.
Yeah. Sorry. Letter received in the correspondence from Mr. Carlsen regarding noise attenuation on the 2180 property. And just have some concerns in regards to how this was going to be handled, and the question regarding the community charter, if staff could help in giving some response and direction to this. Thank you.
Sorry, could you perhaps
so
give a more specific question? Yeah.
Through you, Mayor, to staff, just to clarify how noise attenuation is going to be addressed. And secondly, there's a, regarding a procedural note, there is the community charter, and with respect to MODI approval, so it can't be subject to MODI approval, just for clarification on those two items. Thank you.
So I'll turn to Mr. Humble. But
thank you, Mr. Mayor. So with respect to the noise attenuation matter, I thought we had addressed that at the previous meeting. I think staff indicated that we didn't believe there was a mechanism for staff to address the noise attenuation issue or suggested condition. I know Mr. Carlsen in his letter or his email suggests that it could have been secured through a Section 219 covenant, which would be registered on title. Staff, at least myself, I'm not aware, I don't think planning staff is aware of a mechanism that could be utilized through a Section 219 covenant that could be registered on title to address the noise attenuation. Certainly we didn't request, or council didn't request that staff look to getting a legal opinion on the matter, and maybe a lawyer would say something different, but in my time, 24 years in local government, I've never seen a Section 219 covenant being utilized to address a noise attenuation matter.
thank you. And I think part of the process is that council has approved the rezoning application and the process. So I don't know what process we would have following that approval. But I'll turn the floor back to you, Councillor Duck, who had the question.
Yeah, so it was raised, and I just don't know how we're addressing it. So we're not addressing it is what the answer I'm getting back.
So if I may speak for just a moment. So I believe it was at our October meeting last year. It was at a previous meeting where council did, sorry, it was previous to October. Council requested the developer in their application to provide information with regards to sound attenuation measures. At a subsequent council meeting, we received a multi-page report that indicated the sound attenuation measures that they were taking in terms of wall assembly, construction, windows, and so forth, which was recommended. So the developer actually hired a consultant, and I remember in that report that decibel readings were taken, consideration of aircraft taking off, highway noise was factored in, and that the recommended building assembly, if I can use that phrase, was indicated in the report that came before council. So council didn't consider anything further at that time due to some public input. We did have given further consideration to trying to including the sound attenuation measures being incorporated through a building permit, or as has been suggested most recently, a building covenant or a covenant. So that has been the process, and in terms of it's understanding that will be the sound attenuation measures taken by the developer. If there's a question, perhaps a question through to staff is, given the information that the consultant to the developer provided to council, is there any mechanism by which staff can ensure compliance with what was provided in that report with regards to sound attenuation? I'll turn that through to Mr. Humble.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I think it really comes down to the BC Building Code and the requirements under the BC Building Code. So that would be the absolute requirement in terms of ensuring that the plans submitted for the building permit comply with the current BC Building Code, and that's what staff would be looking for in terms of it. And any requiring anything above and beyond the BC Building Code, I don't think we would have that ability, but maybe I'll defer to Ms. Verhagen if she has something she wants to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Humble. Ms. Verhagen?
Thank you. No, I concur with Mr. Humble. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Duck, I'll turn back to you.
Thank you, staff. And yeah, so at this point, we're essentially under the direction of the building code for BC, and if the developer wants to go above and beyond that, great, but doesn't have to. Is that my understanding?
That's correct.
And then the second part of the letter was just relative to the community charter. Is quite clear that council cannot pass a resolution adopting the bylaw subject to the conditions such as MOTI approval. I'm just seeking clarification on that too, please.
I'm going to turn to Ms. Nelson.
Yes, so with the zoning bylaw amendment, we're sending the approval off to MOTI, and yes, that's correct. We can't adopt a zoning bylaw without the approval of MOTI, and we did receive it at the last meeting, so therefore it was okay to be approved. It wasn't subject to MOTI approval. We received MOTI approval.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, and thank you to staff for the explanations thus far. What I recall from the discussion is, yeah, we had discussion in October, and I remember being under the impression that we could comply, or we could ask developers to comply with noise attenuation, and I think we got a response that said we could. I can't remember if it was going to be condition of zoning bylaw or building permit, and then that turned out not to be the case. And so I guess the question for me is, I know that there's a BC building code sets a minimum standard, but I guess what I would be interested in for future applications, especially if we're going to have residences built alongside the highway again, I would be interested, and maybe it's a motion, I'll make a motion, maybe, that staff review mechanisms available to council to require compliance with noise attenuation measures.
I'm going to rule that out of order, because I think through this process and the public interest in sound attenuation, staff have explored and explained to council at different times what opportunities are available. So I'm not sure what we're asking staff to explore that hasn't been explored.
Well, only because although there's mention of a section 219 covenant, and staff didn't appear to be familiar with that. So I thought it warranted some investigation in terms of, is that something that staff could look into, so that when these things come up again in the future, whether that might be an option available to us.
Could I make a suggestion, and I'll turn to Mr. Humble, but that upon the next application coming forward, adjacent to the highway or where noise is a concern, that at the early stages of the application, we could pass such a motion to request staff to do that.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's putting it out there, and we have no idea when it would come back to us, but it would be specific to that particular application. If you're amenable to that, I turn to Mr. Humble.
Yeah, just in response to your comment regarding the 219 covenants, staff are very familiar with 219 covenants and the use of 219 covenants and how they work and how they're registered on at the land titles office on the property, and they create a condition for a particular property. I'm just not aware of utilizing it in the fashion that's being suggested regarding noise attenuation.
Yeah.
In fact, I think that if we were to reach out to land titles and try to register a covenant of that nature on title, I think they would be quite concerned about it. So short of getting a legal opinion and getting our lawyers to look into it and spending some money on it, I think staff have a clear view on its applicability with respect to noise attenuation.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a couple of questions through you to staff. It was mentioned that the developer in this case had gone to consultants and had said they were going to do X, Y, and Z to improve the sound attenuation on the exterior, on the highway side wall. My question is, were those suggestions from the consultant included in their the plans that they submitted for their development permit?
No, those aren't development. Those are purely building permit related matters or issues that would be submitted as part of the building permit application. Development permits deal with form and character. They don't deal with the particulars of the building construction itself. So again, they wouldn't have submitted those plans yet. They would submit them at the time of building permit. And again, it's not something that we can require. They just have to meet the BC Building Code with respect to their plan submission.
Okay. However, they have made, I wouldn't say a commitment, but they've certainly suggested that they would follow those.
Yeah.
And if they did include them in the building permits plans, and those were the plans that were approved by the town, at that point then they could be obliged to follow through with
Absolutely.
that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Novak. I'm going to bring 14B to a close, and we're turning to 15, which is correspondence for information. We have those 7 remaining items, which we don't require a motion for. We're receiving them by virtue of them being on the agenda. We have no notices of motion. We do have a motion to go under camera under 7, point of order.
Point of order.
Councillor Tack,
Can I bring a notice of motion?
please.
I'd like to.
Tonight it would be read in
Yes.
and then come up for discussion at a future next
Yes.
meeting. Yeah.
My notice of motion is an amendment to the OCP to reflect a change to RM5 and CD 45 definitions. Does that make, I'm
Sure,
fishing
we're
here.
I appreciate you, we're doing this. We may have to go back and forth a little bit with staff to have the appropriate wording, given you're bringing a notice of motion for an OCP amendment. Correct? You want us to
Correct.
proceed with
Yes, correct.
with an OCP amendment. And so if you could specify, you were making reference to 2 zones?
Yes, I'd like to see an amendment to the OCP regarding RM5 and CD 45.
Well, you have to say what.
To increase it from 2.5 story to 3 story. Sorry, I didn't know if I need to give full information.
Okay, does staff consider that appropriate wording for the motion?
Can we get some clarity just on the timing, the urgency, the...
So, thanks, Mr. Humble. So the process would be is by reading it in as a motion this evening, it would appear on the agenda under notices of motion at the next regular council meeting. The motion would come on the floor. We would then look for a seconder, and then we deliberate. Through the deliberations, council would have to relate with staff input, so significant staff input as to what a reasonable timeline would be to proceed. So again, notice giving notice of motion at a meeting is simply reading it in. And my understanding is that while we have this motion, it can be slightly amended for clarity when it does come to the floor for a seconder. Okay, so that motion is read into to the record for next meeting, for the next regular council meeting. I'll now ask our regular Councillor Garnett to read our motion to go in camera, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll move that it is in the opinion of council that the public interest requires that persons other than members of the council and officers be excluded from the meeting to consider confidential matters respecting information received and held in confidence relating to negotiations between the municipality and a provincial government or the federal government, or both, pursuant to section 90.2B of the community charter, and that council continue the meeting in closed session.
We have it moved and seconded by Councillor Duck. All in favor? The motion carries. And if I could have a mover and seconder to adjourn, moved by Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor O'Keefe. Okay. Who was about to make eye contact with me. All in favor? We are adjourned.